Notre Dame fans, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. It is the recruiting hour, and my name is Brian Driscoll. I'm the publisher at irishbreakdown.com, and I'm joined today. This is our first official show with both of my recruiting guys. Ryan Roberts, which is to my left, right? Sean Davis, they're holding the foundation. See, Sean's at the bottom because he's the foundation of this thing, right, Sean? That's what I'm rolling with. We've got some very interesting topics to discuss today. A couple just items to get off to the beginning, and then we'll dive into, there's a lot of talk about where Notre Dame needs to recruit. Where are the best players and those type of things. And Notre Dame's in a really unique situation. And I think that there needs to be a specified plan for what they're doing. I don't think Notre Dame can let's just go find the most random good players we can find. There's always, hey, look, you go where the best players are, but I think there needs to be a strategy of really what the focus is going to be, and that's going to be our discussion today about what we think those regions should look like, and we'll give some numbers and some data to support those type of things. I know one guy's going to mention New Jersey. I don't want to point fingers on who that's going to be. I know one guy's definitely going to talk about Illinois. Again, I don't want to point fingers and, say who that's going to be, but that's what we're going to get into today. And, of course, one guy, I'm not going to say who's going to talk about Virginia. So we'll dive into all of that today. To begin with, Ryan, Notre Dame made a very intriguing offer out today to a 2023. I guess he's a running back, but kind of an athlete kind of guy, and that is Jeremiah Love out of Christian Brothers in St. Louis, which is an area that I promise you we will discuss later today during the show. But very intriguing offer, Ryan. I know that you popped into Kids Film as you were putting the article together about the offer, and he's got some intriguing skills.
No, he absolutely does. And I know it's been obviously a big talking point amongst Notre Dame fans if Notre Dame is going to take a second running back in the class outside of Cedric Urban Jr. And it looks like they are at least interested in the conversation because they just offered, like you said, Jeremiah Love out of Christian Brothers, who look, the first thing that we're going to talk about is the 3-star ranking across every recruiting platform, right? Like he's a mid. Yes.
And on three's rankings, which we will discuss. Okay. They got a couple things right. They actually had him as a top 200 player. So he jumped up. So,
okay. So
before that, when you wrote the article, he was, you were correct.
Yes, yeah. So on 3, apparently in the new ranking has him updated a little higher. Most at this point do have him as a 3-star. I think 24/7 Sports had him the number 23 running back of the country, a 3-star. But when you look at the offer list, that speaks volumes, in my opinion. It was his 24th offer. He has LSU on there. He has Notre Dame, obviously. He has Oregon. He has Stanford. He has Nebraska, Alabama. Washington, Alabama. Like there's a lot of obviously big interest. And he also has Princeton. So he's obviously an high academic kid as well. So 6'1", 195 pounds. He has that long frame. I got a kind of like some Josh Adams, Tevin Coleman type of vibes, right? Because he is a
Tevin Coleman. Who? Hold on a second. Tevin Coleman. Why does that name? Didn't he rush for like 2,000 yards in college?
Yeah, I heard he had a decent running back coach too when he was.
What was that guy's name? Oh man, Sean, help me out here. What was the name of his running back coach in college?
His last name sounded something like McCullough.
Dylan McCullough, right? Yeah. Okay, yeah. What's he up to these days? I'm curious. Sorry, Ryan. I'm in one of those weird moves today. I like the Josh Adams comp though. That's what I was thinking about Notre Dame. He's not quite as tall as Josh, but really long-legged dude with that real high knee running style. Yes. Right. So please continue, Ryan.
Yeah, no. I mean, it set it up perfectly. He's a high-cut kid. He is let's get a foot in the ground, let's get vertical, and he's got the home run speed. I mean, he's a double for the track team for Christian Brothers. He's a 700-meter guy. So this kid has a lot of speed. Averaged over 10 yards a carry last year, was I think just south of 1,000 yards, only 95 carries. So he was over 10 yards a carry, 14 touchdowns. He averaged more yards per carry than he did per reception last year, which is a pretty crazy stat to look at. So this kid is there's talent here. And I think that the offer list speaks volumes to the caliber of player this is. I'm happy to hear that On 3 had him higher in the ranking than where he is on other recruiting platforms.
They didn't get it all wrong.
They didn't get it all wrong.
They got a lot of it wrong. But not all of
it. Well, they got this one right. Notre Dame adds what seems to be a very talented running back to the board. Let's see what obviously happens and materializes from here on out. But he is an impressive offer list. He's obviously a very talented athlete, if nothing else. And Notre Dame obviously sees something that they like in Jeremiah Love.
You keep saying that, talented athlete. And I think that hits the nail on the head, because when you watch the kid play, he's not necessarily a great football player yet. He's looks like a track kid that's starting to learn how to play football, is what I saw from film. And again, you see that long stride, and sometimes those long strides get him in a little bit of trouble, because he doesn't have, he gets, you need to turn those long strides up once you get in the open field, but you need to be a little bit, have a little bit better base in the backfield, but that's part of it. But man, you see him when he gets a crease and he gets an open field, he's going. I mean, you can see that speed really pop up, but the 95 carries is also evidence that, the kid obviously still is learning a lot about the game of football. So I agree. And he's got some athletic traits that make you think. The guy that really popped in my head athletically, Josh Adams, makes sense as a running back, but the guy that athletically made sense to me, CJ Procise. Just kind of similar body type, is going to be a thicker framed kid, I think, than Josh Adams was, in my opinion, and a guy that maybe could be something else down the road.
Right.
No, maybe not just a pure running back. So very, very intriguing offer. And obviously the next step will be trying to get him on campus. So that'll be the next step for Notre Dame. But I like kids like that, guys. I think that there's always a need for, hey, let's take a chance on a kid that's got a great frame and great athleticism and say, hey, look, this is what we get paid the big bucks for, right? Is to teach kids how to play football. And I think that's something I'm very curious to see with this staff, because I feel like confident coaches love kids like this. Because I can coach the kid up. I mean, just give me the God-given ability. I can coach him up, right? But I can't coach you to be a 10-7 in the 100-meter dash. I can't coach you to be 6'1", 195, right? I can coach you how to take a hand off, how to get on your track, how to make moves and all that kind of stuff. So very intrigued by that offer.
Yeah, fellas, man, just to mention, I reached out when I saw it on Twitter that he was offered. I reached out to Carl Reed, who was a coach in that division. He coached Christian Gray. Most people will know Christian Gray is a DB 2023 offer and target for Notre Dame out of St. Louis DeMet. He's out of the same conference, a highly competitive conference as DeMet. Christian Brothers actually beat DeMet twice, gave them their only 2 losses last season.
They've beat him several times in recent years, Sean. They beat him at least once when Jordan Johnson was a senior there as well. I think they might have beat him twice.
The playoff matchup wasn't even close.
Yeah.
In his words, he texted me today. He said he's big time, elite, legit speed, great balance, and vision. So obviously they've tabbed what this kid is. You talked about Josh Adams. I'm very interested in how they use him. And you were kind of tapping into that a little bit, Brian. It's going to be amazing because usage-wise, he might end up being closer to CJ Procise as far as maybe being in the slot, sliding into the backfield for certain downs. Right. But the other thing he said, when they played us, he always made the game-breaking play. The game would always be close, and he was the guy that made the game-breaking play. So,
what we don't know right now, Sean, is he's still developing as a guy, had 95 touches as a junior, right? Can he be an every down back? I don't think we know the answer to that yet. But to your point, CJ to me shouldn't have been an every down back. I still feel like if they would have done a better job of using Josh Adams and using Dexter Williams, even though they were just freshmen, using them more once Torian went down, maybe CJ doesn't wear down and get hurt late in the year. Like he did. And I would have loved to have seen what Notre Dame could have done in the Fiesta Bowl with a healthy CJ Procise to go with a healthy Will Fuller and some of the other guys that they had. So, those are things you kind of look at and say, well, at the very least, he can give you sort of like Ryan, you talked about Tevin Coleman. That's how they used Tevin Coleman the year before he really took off, right? He was more of that home run hitter. Now, he became an every down back. What was it, 2014, I think, is when he had the breakout year. He had over 2,000 yards and all that kind of stuff. But, the year before, he didn't get as many touches the year before. He got 131. Stephen Houston got 112. The quarterback carried the ball 85 times. Had another guy, D'Angelo Roberts, carried it 52 times. So, they kind of split those carries around a little bit. Then, of course, the next year, Tevin went off. But, the 2013, he only carried the ball 131 times, right? And and barely over 10 a game because he played 9 games that year. But he had 12 touchdowns, 7.3 yards per carry. The next year he rushes for over 2,000 yards, but he averaged 7.5 yards a carry, right? Long strider, so Dylan McCullough has kind of shown he can have success with that kind of back. And I find that very, very interesting. Jordan Howard was also kind of a longer back. He was like 6'1", if I remember correctly, coming out. So he has shown that he can kind of work with those long striders and find a great deal of success with them. So I find that very intriguing. And this is kind of the first, I would say, and I don't know who offered him. I'd have to go. I forget. I don't know if he said in the tweet about that. Let me go see if he said which Notre. He didn't say anything about. So Dre Brown, looks like Dre Brown was the guy that offered him. Looks like, or at least that's the only Notre Dame coach he tweeted. But this is kind of the first running back we've seen offered since Dylan McCullough took over. So I find that interesting as well. So I find, we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's all about obviously identifying those players, right? And the offer list, I think, speaks for itself more than anything. And I kind of like the usage conversation that you're talking about a little bit, Brian, because one thing that I put in the piece that's going to be up on the site soon about the offer is I feel like he's a really nice compliment to what they have already in the class in Cedric Urban Jr. I feel like they kind of complement each other well, because I don't know if you would ever call Cedric a dynamic player, but I think that the consistent approach that he brings to the game, the dependability, that I feel like he could be a guy that could carry a decent amount of volume. And then you add in this speed that Love has potentially if they're able to land it. I feel like that's a decent pairing. Yeah. At least the skill sets mesh pretty well together.
Right. Absolutely.
And Ryan makes a great point, because we talked to Dylan McCullough at the media breakout sessions. He talked about the room he walked into at Notre Dame and the different styles is the way he would set up his running back room. So who's getting ready to leave more than likely will be the first one to leave? The slasher, the guy with the elite speed, Chris Tyree. So it makes sense that he would identify a guy like this that could possibly be in that same mold and also be on special teams and say, he'll fit Chris Tyree when he leaves. I'll still have Logan Diggs. I'll still have –
and Jadarian Price fits that as well.
Right. Absolutely. So it makes sense. Yep.
Yeah. And, one thing, I think that's an advantage where NFL backgrounds, like I used to be very much against bringing NFL coaches to college football, very much against it 10 years ago. But I feel like there's so much more carryover now, schematically and with different things that they do, that now like guys like Dylan McCullough, who has sort of an NFL background recently, but is more of a college lifer, right? Up until that point. The thing that the NFL brings that I think the college game has actually been, in my opinion, ahead of the NFL in some areas schematically in the last 5-6 years, and where you're seeing more of the college and NFL coaches kind of following each other. It's why, I feel like the college game really came with the RPOs correct, like hard before, maybe the NFL game. At least that was kind of my read on it. But the point is, one area where I think the NFL has been really way ahead of the game, and it's something I think the college game needs to catch up on, especially in this era of transfers and things like that, is in the NFL, it's become so package oriented, situational package oriented, right? And yes, it's that way on defense, but it's becoming more that way on offense as well, where especially at running back. And I think that one of the criticisms we've had, at least, well, let me rephrase that. One of the criticisms I've had at Notre Dame in recent years is they just haven't played enough depth when they've had it, right? Sometimes you don't have the depth. I mean, there's been years where linebacker, like you can't play your number 2 linebacker because there's a big drop off between 1 and 2, right? They had some issues like that at D-line in past years, right? But now, like receiver in recent years, running back, where we've complained, like, why aren't they playing more guys? You've got some really good players. Like, why did it take Chris Tyree getting hurt this year for Logan Diggs to get on the field? Right? Why did Audric Estime get carries in one game? And then when he got carries, like, this dude can ball. Like, what? You couldn't find a role for this guy somewhere? In the NFL, like with Dylan McCullough, if you guys go back and look, he didn't have a number 1 back. I mean, there was one year that I don't even think it had a single back at 500 yards rushing in 16 games, because in the NFL, there's more of like, okay, this is our package. And I feel like if they can bring that to the college game, That should really help Notre Dame because that's a better way to say, I got these 3 backs that can all play. Let's find roles for them, right? And I think that's an important thing. And then that's also going to leave you more susceptible or likely to go out and find more versatile players that can do multiple things. It also means you're not going to be afraid to bring in a guy that right now maybe can only do one thing. And that's the thing about Jeremiah Love is maybe right now he's just a home run hitter. And Ryan, to your point, and Sean, you mentioned this as well, maybe he can develop that entire package. Maybe he can. But if he can't, you at least know he's bringing this one thing, and you can use that. But if you're a program that doesn't know how to use sort of niche players or role players effectively, then you're going to be less prone to go after a kid like that. And I think that's a positive thing for Notre Dame. I really do.
I've said it.
Give me more Xavier Watts. Give me more guys like that, and not fewer.
Yeah, well, I've said it in the past, Brian. I feel like this Notre Dame coaching staff, at least the ideology behind recruiting right now, is they are really trusting their staff because they're going after big-time athletes. Like we talked about Darian Gillette last one, right? The linebacker, obviously, that is by some accounts only a 3-star by depending on what recruiting database you look at. But then you look at the numbers that he's able to put up and the responsibilities and the fact that he's an all-state basketball player, the fact that he's a really nice track and field athlete. Like they're targeting these athletes, and I think they're really trusting that the coaches will be able to put them in position and be able to develop them properly. And I mean, there's maybe not as much of a floor there, right? There's more of the ceiling aspect to it. But I think when you trust your coaching staff, those are the gambles you take because you believe that they can be developed and you develop them properly.
Mm-hmm. So we do have a super chat that we'll get to here before we get going. AST 12321. Given that Chris Vizina is now ranked well above Dante Moore, maybe we shouldn't be worried about Vizina coming to Notre Dame. Just kidding. Don't yell at me. I'm going to be honest with you, AST. If you had not put that JK in there, I might have yelled at you. He's referring to the new On3 rankings that came out today. So I wrote an article. I saw that they moved Keon Keeley up to number 3. They had him at number 4, so it wasn't like a huge jump, but still very newsworthy. So I wrote an article about it, talking to Ryan, and hey, I'm going to do an article on the whole release because the whole release is coming afterwards. Then as I started like writing down where the guys were ranked in the new rankings, I was like, there's no way I'm doing an article on this. It's so freaking bad. One of them being they have Chris Vizina number 20 overall. It's fine. Higher than I would have him, but he's a good football player. I'm not going to like crush you for it. I'd have him more in like 75, 90 range. We talked about that. I think, Ryan, you have said what, like 50 to 75? It's probably, was that what you said? With
yeah.
And they had Dante Moore at number 49. They had Drake Bowen at number 207. Brendan Vernon was barely a top 200 player. Justin Rhett wasn't even in the top 300. They dropped Samuel Mpemba from like 104 from number 14 to like out of the top 100. They had, of course, Arch number 1, right? Whatever. But some of the rankings they had, like, and some of them could benefit Notre Dame. I mean, obviously Keon Keeley. They had Peyton Bowen in the 30s, which is good. They had Charles Jagasaw number 7 overall, 5-star player. But some of the rankings were, and it wasn't even just Notre Dame players. Like they had AJ Harris number 70. If there are 48 better players in the country than Dante Moore and 69 better players in the country than AJ Harris, this is the best recruiting group of players in the history of high school football. I mean, just some of the rankings were just, I mean, they had Braylon James at like 260 something. I'm sending a buddy a text to money, just some of these ridiculous rankings, and I just couldn't believe it. Like Anthony Hill at number 68, Jaden Osbury at number 168. I mean, some of them were just like, what in the – and it wasn't just Notre Dame guys. I mean, there just was some awful rankings in there. It just I mean, Anthony Hill's not going to Notre Dame, but there are not 67 better football players in the country than Anthony Hill. I mean, it just – some of this stuff is just absurd, just beyond absurd. So that's all we're going to say about it, to be honest with you, because it was that bad where it's like they got to be – they have to be doing it for clicks, guys. New service, new site. They've got to be doing it so people will talk about it. And I've talked about it more than I care to talk about it. It was that bad.
Yeah.
This is the same outlet that had Devin Brown as the number 1 player in the country last year and didn't think Junior Tuilaumaka or CJ Williams were 4-star players. So whatever. I mean, you know what I mean? Like it is what it is. So if you guys have anything you want to say about it, otherwise we can move on unless you guys have some thoughts on,
I I don't want to sound biased, obviously, because we're talking about a lot of the Notre Dame rankings. But like you said, like a kid like Anthony Hill being in the 60s,
Right.
it's I mean,
He's not
I watched
coming to Notre Dame. Yeah,
exactly, and I watched like 5 clips of him. I'm like, that kid's playing in the NFL someday. Like, there's no
yeah,
doubt about it.
yeah.
You know, like it's
Well,
just
like Jaden
it's silly
Osbury's
stuff.
another one. I don't think Jaden Osbury's coming to Notre Dame. I've made that very clear. It's absurd to have. If you had him at number 68, I'd say that's too low. They got him at 168. AJ Harris isn't coming to Notre Dame. Having him at number 70 is beyond absurd. Like beyond absurd. That kid is a dude.
Yeah.
So it's not just the Notre Dame rankings. I mean, I could have gone. There were so many in there that I'm like, and because some of the absurd rankings I think are good for Notre Dame. I'm not going to mention them, but some of them are like, there's no way that guy should be there. But it's good for Notre Dame. You know, I mean, just it was nuts. But yeah, they have to be doing it for attention. So I love this comment from Zacho. More like off 3. Am I right? Oh, very well done, my friend. Very, very, very well done. All right, guys, let's get to the topic that we wanted to discuss today. And that is looking at the regions and establishing which regions around the country are the most important to Notre Dame. And the premise being that when you are building your recruiting operation, when you're building up kind of, hey, here's who we're going to be as an institution, here's what we're going to be as a program, you know, this is the type of player we're going to recruit. You also have to kind of come up with the game plan of where are we going to recruit? And I think that even in this era of, you know, you can kind of go anywhere you want. Notre Dame's a national program, all these other type of things. You know, I look at it and say, I still feel like you have to have a plan of attack where certain areas need special attention. And maybe some areas you go down there like you target certain areas for certain types of players, but it's not an area you're going to invest all your resources. And I think that's a really important thing for Notre Dame. And I feel like in the past, they would like an area would become important for like a 2-year cycle. And then the next year they paid like no attention to it. And then there were certain areas you're just like, why are they not recruiting this area? This makes no sense to me. Right. And so we're going to discuss what we think should be the base area, like the main areas. And we kind of broke it down into several areas, right? There's the base, right? Like this has got to be your base. You've got to just dominate this area. And what that means is, you know, if there's players that are on your level, you have to get them. You have to not only identify them, but you got to go get them. Then there's sort of your regional strengths, right? Like if you could kind of go a state away. So like if you look at Clemson, right? When I looked at their first title team, maybe it's their second title team, but like 75% of their scholarship players were either from South Carolina, a state that borders South Carolina, or a state that bordered a state that bordered. So I mean, so it's like very regional. Those areas for Notre Dame are also important. Then you kind of get like a home away from home. What are some areas outside of your region that, you know, those states that border you or border your bordering states that you feel you can have success or should have success for whatever reason? Maybe it's just a place where there's a lot of Catholic schools. Maybe it's a place where, you know, there's some states, Ryan, that we're going to discuss. Obviously, New Jersey will be one we'll get into where there is no big in-state power. Right. And the Maryland, D.C. area, there's not really a big in-state power. Maryland's not that program. Virginia's that way. Virginia aren't big state, you know, big time programs like Georgia is at Georgia and those other places. And then sort of the impact areas, you know, maybe areas where you're never going to get a ton of players, but that's where you go look for and find your dudes. And then, of course, we'll talk about the big boys. And that would be Texas and Florida for sure. And we're going to have a very interesting conversation about how California should be viewed by Notre Dame, because I think it should be viewed a little differently for Notre Dame than maybe it should be if you're at a different school. So, guys, let's begin with the base area. And I think we can all agree on this. The base area is and one of the premises of this article, the data points that we use is, you know, where can you find top talent? And a lot of the things we're going to talk about today is I went and looked at the NFL released a breakdown of opening day rosters, where everybody was from in opening day rosters. And you look at some of the states and the states that we all consider the big boys, right? Florida had 192. Texas had 189. California had 168. Georgia had 124. The next state was Ohio at 70. So those are just numbers to keep in mind, where Indiana had 20, right? So Notre Dame can't say, what's your base area? Indiana, because you're just not going to get enough players to compete with the big boys only from Indiana. But I think the area that we can agree, I believe we all agree on this, we discussed this before, that has to be sort of your base. You have to have, if there's a guy that is on your level, you can't miss on him. You have to get him. That is Indiana, Illinois, especially the central northeastern part of Illinois up towards Chicago, right? Because you start getting down towards like East St. Louis and different parts of Illinois, it's a little tougher to be like a Notre Dame base area. And I think you if you disagree with that, Sean, just let me know after this. And then the third area is the Ohio public. Yeah, the Ohio Catholic schools.
Yeah.
The Cleveland and Cincinnati and Dayton and Columbus area, those four big kind of areas where there's a lot of really good players that go to Catholic schools. Areas where Notre Dame has had success and they really need to continue to have success. So you look down the Southwest, you look at St. X, you look at Elder, you look at Moeller, you look at the Northeast, St. Ignatius, right? St. Edward, programs like that. Dublin Kaufman, where Brady Quinn came from, which is in the Columbus area. You look at where Malik came from, Archbishop Alter, right? You know, those are areas that have been very good to Notre Dame. Should always be good to Notre Dame, can still serve as a bit of a feeder to Notre Dame because they are more traditional, you know, like there's still a strong Notre Dame presence at the schools, not even football-wise, just at the schools, or maybe you're not finding that as much in other Catholic schools. So to me, guys, every year Notre Dame needs to make sure that they are getting the best of the best from Indiana, Illinois, and the Chicago and the Ohio Catholic schools. That to me is the base area where Notre Dame has to be they have to have a very high win rate on the recruiting trail.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just some of the names, obviously, right? Like you mentioned, Brian, the data suggests that Indiana is at the lower end as far as producing NFL talent, but we have seen Notre Dame obviously have success in the past with guys like Blake Fisher and Jalen Smith, and I know Gunnar Kiel was obviously a highly ranked
Tyler
player
Eifert,
out of
the
there.
Martin brothers,
Sheldon Day, Drew Tranquil. Like, there's been a lot of guys that have come out of the state of Indiana. I think the key thing there is it's not going to produce a ton of talent,
right,
but we need to identify the right talent. Like, you can't miss on a George Karlaftis, in my opinion. Like, you can't miss on that kid if you have a chance to get him and he's in the state. Even if he has the Purdue ties, you have to get that kid. You have to identify him, and obviously that extends out to, like you said, the Ohio Catholic, Illinois. Obviously, we got guys like Charles Jagasa that is a big target in the 2023 class. Obviously, for them, we have guys like Drake Bowen in this class. Notre Dame has already committed linebacker out of the state of Indiana. Those are the kids that, if you identify them, they have to get. Like, it can't be a battle, in my opinion. Like, if you want an Indiana kid as Notre Dame, you have to get your Indiana kid if you deem them as a proper fit. So that I agree. That is the mainstay. That is the base. You have to get those kids.
And Illinois, Sean, is an area where there has been some – Illinois is just not especially Chicago. Chicago used to be the feeder area for Notre Dame. I mean, it used to be like the number one driver of players in Notre Dame. And you know, back in the day, the Catholic League schools were powerhouses back in the day. You know what I mean? I think Mount Carmel, even when I was starting to kind of come up in high school, Mount Carmel was still a powerhouse back then, right? St. Rita, I mean, they would all produce some players. And you know, it just as a lot of northern areas have, there's been a lot of population shifts and job markets cause people to migrate to other parts of the country, which is why the Carolinas are coming up now and Atlanta's coming up now and things like that. But to me, there's still enough big time players out of Chicago that Notre Dame hasn't been getting that they have to turn it around. I mean, like look at last year, Caleb Brown. I mean, it's a guy you have to try to be able to get, you know what I mean? And they weren't even in the game for him. Now you say, well, maybe there's some, but so you gotta try. And this year you look at Cardinal Tate. I mean, yes, he's an IMG now, but he's a Chicago kid, Sean. You've talked to him. He views himself as still as a Chicago kid, correct? You have to start.
Chicago kid.
Yeah, you can't keep getting beat by Ohio State and Michigan for the AJ Henning, right?
Yeah.
You have to start. They've done well in Chicago, like the Riley Millses and the Pat Coogans, but that's fine. But there's enough athletes. Like Caleb Brown, to me, was a top 50 national player. They weren't even in the game with him. He's just I like Coach Reese, but I never hear from the receivers coach, right? Can't ever have that. right? You can't have that from, you can't have that from. You can't not get Carnell Tate. Like, you have to get Carnell Tate, right? Like, at some point in time, you have to be able to do that.
Well, we can go back. That AJ Henning recruitment, and I remember this vividly, was so disappointing because everyone in the Southland area for 2 years, it was almost a done deal if you talk to everyone. AJ Henning was going to Notre Dame. And something happened like in the last 6 months, like right before his senior season started. Something transitioned in his recruiting, and all of a sudden it just became Michigan.
Right.
And it was just like, yo, what happened? Because it came out of nowhere. And you hear these stories in recruiting. It could be something as simple as a phone call gone wrong or a visit gone wrong or whatever. Something happened that transitioned and shifted everything from Notre Dame being on top to Michigan, and he ends up in Ann Arbor. And that's a big-time game changer on multiple levels, whether it's special teams, you can put him in the slot, you can put him in the backfield. That's the type of guy you have to get into a program to be able to make big plays against big-time opponents. So let's talk about Carnell Tate. Carnell Tate, the only reason he's not here at Marist is because of the COVID-19 pandemic, forced him to make the move down to IMG. I talked to him and frankly asked him, there are rumors out there that he will be coming back to play with his team who lost in the semifinals of the state championship in the 7A division. And he said, no, I'm going to stick it out and stay at IMG as much as I love my teammates. But you're talking about a kid who said Notre Dame was the first school that got on him. And that was refreshing to hear. Like Notre Dame was the first school to come after him to give him his first offer. And he's had a connection to Notre Dame. Of course, with the transition with different coaches, things of that nature, he took a recent picture at a 7-on-7 camp and tournament here in Chicago about 2 weeks ago with former Notre Dame wide receiver coach Dale Alexander. There's still a relationship there. When I talked to him, he informed me that there was nothing negative said about Notre Dame in their conversation, and he was very he talked well about the staff and specifically Marcus Freeman. So I just wanted to make sure that there was no negative recruiting going on. And he basically informed me that that wasn't the case, but they're still pretty close. Notre Dame has targeted, and we talked about this because Tommy Rees, offensive coordinator, who starred at Lake Forest in the Chicagoland area as a quarterback, is leading the way and reestablishing Notre Dame as being a prime, big-time, go-get-'em program here in the Chicagoland area. There are two transitions happening here. The public school system, from an athletic standpoint, is once again getting back to the level it was when Lou Holtz came in here and got a guy like Chris Sorge. During that era in the 80s, the public schools were churning out big-time players going to big-time D1 programs that ultimately ended up being big-time NFL stars. The same thing is happening now. You see public schools once again winning state championships in the 6A, 7A, and 8A. When Jaleel Billingsley decided to transfer from Alabama, the first school to jump on him, and most people would laugh, was Brett Bielema and the Fighting Illini down in Champaign. It's like their message is, we want to keep our kids home to make this program great. That's been their mantra to all the best guys. So Notre Dame has come in and countered with that, not only in the 23 class, but they're reaching out to kids in the 24 class as well. Notre Dame has offered 5 of the top 10 players in Illinois. The other 5 players are south of the region that Notre Dame usually gets players. So what you talked about, the state of Illinois, basically, most people know. Above, I-74, highly Democratic from a political standpoint. Below that, it's totally different. It's almost like 2 different states.
It's very rural. It's a completely
rural,
different. Yeah, I mean, I did a ministry class out there where I actually had to stay out in Illinois for like 2 weeks and doing like rural ministry. And it's like, I'm in Illinois. Like the only place I'd ever been in Illinois was Chicago.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, but it's completely, it's like Indiana. I mean, northern Indiana and southern Indiana, very different.
Yep. You're talking about Jagasol, who's the #1 player in the state. Caden Fegan, who's number 3, Malik Elsie, who's number 4 from Simeon. Then you go down to Jair Hill out of Kankakee, who's sitting at 7, and then Brooks Barr, who's a kid that I've talked to that is chomping at the bit to get that offer. Like if he gets an offer tomorrow, his commitment might be the same day. Like he is that ecstatic. He's been to Notre Dame 3 times on 3 different occasions. He's going to get up there for the spring and visit. He's out of a powerhouse, Loyola Academy up there in Wilmette, powerhouse in the state of Illinois. So he knows what it's all about. He knows about being in a prestigious program, what it's like to walk in those doors and live up to expectations. So big time guy that plays deep power DN for Loyola, but he definitely will be in that D tackle situation with Notre Dame if they decide to go with him. They've targeted the best of the best in Illinois. Mm-hmm. So they definitely got the message that if we're going to take that next step and go out and get the best kids, we have to make sure that our base is dominated by us. And they've done a great job reaching out and recruiting those kids in the 23 and ultimately what we'll see next year in the 24 class.
Because they got 0 kids out of Illinois last year.
Yeah.
0.
Yeah.
Now, some of them were from areas like the top 2 players in the state last year, Luther Burden and Toriano Pride. That's not an area where Notre Dame's going to have – they're just not going to do well in St. Louis.
He was a Missouri kid all the way. Right. But this is the kicker. There's a new program that has become a nemesis, and that will, in my opinion, will be a nemesis if they continue to play the way they played last year under their head coach. Sam Pittman did an incredible job turning Arkansas around. And Arkansas is in on a lot of the top 10 kids in Illinois, especially the 2 big linemen out of East St. Louis. They have a tackle and a guard. I think they rank 2 and 6 in the state of Illinois. And both of those guys have Arkansas on the list. The top guy, of course, he's going to Alabama, in my opinion. He's a big-time offensive tackle. You'll see him playing on Sundays.
So if you look at Indiana, Illinois, and the Ohio Catholic League, the Ohio Catholic schools, right, they produced 85 NFL players at the start of the 2021 season. Mm-hmm. That's more than the state of Ohio. If you take out the Catholic school kids, that's 56 in Ohio. They produce 70. So the point is, even if you look at Indiana and Illinois and just that small region, that's 85. That's a good number of NFL players relative to other places. I mean, once you get past the top 4, that's a good number. I think then you move on to the sort of the regional schools, right? And the reason that we don't count Michigan the same way we do Illinois is because in Illinois, there's not a big time program. Like, let's be honest, Sean, if Notre Dame and Illinois are going after big time players more often than not, that guy, if he is a fit for Notre Dame, if you catch my drift, he's going to go to Notre Dame more often than not, right? Let's just be honest. Now, maybe Bielema can change that down the road, but that's always been true, right? That's almost always been true. And so when you look at Michigan, that's different because there's one big-time program in the state and another one that is a very strong pull in the state in Michigan State. So Michigan and Michigan State. So Michigan has to be looked at different than Illinois because you can't expect to just walk into Michigan and take the best players every year, right? It's going to be more challenging. So and same thing with Pennsylvania. Now, Notre Dame has always done well in Pennsylvania, but you've always had to deal with Penn State. Penn State's going to get their fair share of big-time players. Pitt used to, but I still now I feel like if Notre Dame and Pitt are going against each other for a kid, you're going to get them. Or maybe in 1978, 1979, 1980, it would have been tougher to get them out of Pitt. You're now going to get those guys if you want them, if it's just you versus Pitt, right? I mean, I can't tell you the last time Notre Dame lost to Pitt for a kid that Notre Dame wanted and could get into school. So when you look at that region, so it's either states that border Indiana or border a state that borders Indiana. You look at Michigan, Ohio, non-Catholic school Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky, right? And Pennsylvania's got to be an area where, look, Ryan, and the thing about it is one of the things we discuss is we're just talking about NFL players, but what you don't see from like Indiana and what you don't see as much from the Ohio Catholic schools and some in Illinois, but not as much. A lot of the guys that you look at the positions, it's linemen, linebackers, defensive linemen, it's running backs. It's not receivers and, corners. Pennsylvania is a little different because Pennsylvania does produce some of those athletes. Rodney Gallagher being who's the most dynamic player to play for Notre Dame in the last 20 years? It's a kid from Philly. Will Fuller, right?
Yeah.
I said last week, I think I said Rodney Gallagher being a Philly kid. What in the world? He's a Western.
I was like, he's
kid.
he's the up there.
I was
Penn
like,
State.
wait a minute, what?
He's not.
I was like, did I just say that? But again, that's even better for Notre Dame because their success rate on the western part of the state is even higher than their success rate in the eastern part of the state. And so you look at those 4 areas. Michigan, you're going to get some athletes from there. I mean, they're trying to get a quarterback from there. The Detroit area, Notre Dame, and this is why Dante Moore is so important. Detroit, so when you look at the rankings, Michigan is 12th when it comes to produce as a state, when it comes to producing NFL players at 49. That's a good number, right?
Yeah.
It's a good number. It's not a great number. If they're really 12th, I added Maryland and DC together. That got them 1 above Michigan. But if you make Maryland and DC separate, then Michigan's up to 12, which again, out of 50 states is pretty good, right? And so, but when you look at Detroit, it's a different ball game because Detroit by itself. So when you look at the NFL, like the breakdown the NFL did, I think that Detroit, if I'm looking at this correctly, and I am, Detroit is 4th amongst just cities with 14. Miami has 19, Houston has 18, New Orleans has 15, and Detroit has 14. Like that, so like Detroit, a lot of the talent from Michigan is like centralized in like that one area that's 2.5 hours away from South Bend, Indiana. Now, are there just going to be some kids in Detroit that you just are not going to have a shot with? Yeah, that's true in Chicago. That's true in Indianapolis. That's true in South Bend. That's true everywhere. There's just going to be some kids you can't get in with. But that's why I think Dante Moore they have to win that one. Not just because of what Dante can bring as an elite quarterback who is much better than the number 49 overall player in the country, because it's going to show Detroit public school kids, if you handle your business in the classroom like Dante did, Notre Dame, you can have the opportunity to go to a place like Notre Dame. And I think that is huge because that is an area really close to campus and what does Detroit tend to produce more of? Skill players, right? It's not just a bunch of linemen. Now you're going to get some of them. I mean, you obviously Khalid Kareem was not from Detroit, but like outside. Dalen Hayes was like a little north of. Dalen was kind of all over. He went to like 4 different high schools, but the point being is like you're going to get some athletic dudes from there. Yeah. And so, and same with Pennsylvania, you're going to get some really athletic kids from there. There's going to be the Rodney Gallaghers from Pennsylvania. There's going to be the Josh Adamses from Pennsylvania. I mean, really the 2 most dynamic players that Notre Dame has had in the last 10 years on offense, just statistically, Will Fuller and Josh Adams. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Where are they both from? Pennsylvania. Right. You give me a roster full of Josh Adamses and Will Fullers. Bring on Bama, right? Bring on Ohio State, right? I mean, that's the reality of it. So you don't have to go down to Florida and Texas and New Orleans and all those to get dynamic athletes. You just have to make sure you're getting them out of the state of Pennsylvania and then getting them out of Detroit. So to me, guys, that's that next region. In that region of Michigan, Ohio, I took out the Catholic school kids. Pennsylvania, Kentucky produced 179 NFL players, which would rank 3rd. Right. Well, that region's not that much smaller than the state of Texas or the state of California geographically. Right. And Kentucky, obviously, Notre Dame's best player on returning on their offense this year is from Kentucky. Right. So we're showing that you can get those guys. You just have to really make sure that you're upping your success rate. Your success rate in those areas has to be better. And that's it's going to take a very concerted effort to make that happen. And that's what they have to do, guys.
I have a question for both of you guys. Is Brian, you specifically being from the North New Jersey, PA area, Notre Dame is really going hard at Michigan right now in the Detroit area. In my opinion, you have to take advantage of certain trends in recruiting, especially if you're Notre Dame. I think the previous 2 years saw a little bit of the shine come off of Jim Harbaugh and the Michigan program. Now they recovered, had a nice season, but leading up to this season, there was a little bit of shine off that program. And then they've had transition of coaches in this offseason and his flirtation with the NFL and everything. that can play a key role as well in the way some of these kids look at Michigan out of Detroit. And now Notre Dame's coming in and they make their imprint. The same thing when you talk about what's going on with the Penn State program. I think they've underperformed, in my opinion, over the last 3 years based upon what preseason rankings and expectations were. Now Notre Dame gets an opportunity to go in, get on a guy like Rodney Gallagher, get him out of Philly. Heck, let's just be honest. It's the Lou Holtz blueprint.
Right.
When he came to Notre Dame, it's like you go get Rocket and Ricky Waters.
Right.
Go get them from Pennsylvania.
Right.
When they were supposed to be at Penn State or either Pitt. Like, that is the blueprint that Notre Dame, thankfully, that they're going down that road. They're being aggressive, and they're not depending on what some of the other regimes depended on, which was we got to get kids out of Florida. We got to get kids out of Texas. We got to get kids out of California. They're scouring the entire country, going to get the best kids from wherever.
And they should.
Yeah.
But the point is, I think they did it at the expense too often of the areas that we've discussed. And in another area we're going to discuss in a second, right? And that's the problem for me, is it's fine. You should go everywhere. But you have to make sure you're making a concerted effort in those areas, right? And I think Pennsylvania is the one for me, Ryan, that has been the most head-scratching in recent years, because I don't see why Pennsylvania has seemed to take a back seat to Notre Dame in recent seasons, and I don't quite understand why. Why did it take convincing of some coaches who are no longer here to make Rodney Gallagher a priority? Right. Whereas Chancey Stuckey shows up and he's like, yeah, thank you. Yes, please. You know, and it's that's an unforced error, guys. That's the problem I have. It's the unforced errors.
Well, it's a great point. I think Sean also brought up a great point about the fact of we're going to talk about New Jersey a little later, right? Like, New Jersey is a feeder to the Michigans and the Notre Dames when they want those kids, because there's no in-state power, like you said before, Brian. And now that Michigan's having, again, they had a good season, but you hear Coach Harbaugh every single year, is he going to go to the NFL? Well, let's capitalize on that type of momentum, right? If you're Notre Dame. Penn State has been down recently over the last couple years, even though they're still recruiting at a decent rate. But great point to say about Pennsylvania, because you could look at the Michigan and not so much the Catholic versus public school conversation, but they've had some obvious wins over the last couple of years in Joshua Burnham and Nolan Ziegler and Rocco Spindler. And you talked about Dalen Hayes and Adi Ogundiyi. There's been success obviously in Michigan, but when I was looking up just the best recruits that Notre Dame's gotten from Pennsylvania, you're not talking about guys that is recent. The most recent guys are Phil Dracovic, Josh Lugg, but then it's historic, a little more, going back a little bit of a ways, the Mike McGlincheys of the world, the Josh Adams, like you said, the Will Fullers. The list is not a recently, based list, right? These are talking more on a historical level, and you need to go into there because regionally it makes sense. Penn State is not the power that it had been at some points, right? They went 7-5 this year, and they gave their head coach a crazy contract extension. There's no world right now where Notre Dame shouldn't be able to compete for a Rodney Gallagher, even though he's a Pennsylvania kid, even though Tamir Robinson's up near there, the linebacker. And if you want Tamir Robinson, Penn State can't stop you from getting Tamir Robinson, in my opinion. You need to start making moves in Pennsylvania, because we've seen moves in Michigan. We've seen moves in Ohio. Why is Pennsylvania the one that seems to be a little bit untapped in recent years? I think it's a great point.
And you look at Nicholas Singleton in last year's class. That guy is a legitimate big-time player. You look at Marvin Harrison Jr. Look at Ohio State's receiving core. And this year's going to have a very strong Pennsylvania influence, right? With Marvin Harrison Jr., with Julian Fleming, and you look at some of the athletes that they've produced. They're producing some good football players. And Notre Dame has not done well in Pennsylvania. They haven't even tried to do well in Pennsylvania. And that's one of the things that I actually had someone bring up to me. Is man, they're recruiting too many coaches that have Midwestern ties. I'm thinking, thank God. You know what I mean? That's a good thing. You look at Jared Parker's from Kentucky, Tommy Reese is from Illinois, Dylan McCullough's from Ohio, Marcus Freeman's from Ohio, Mike Mickens is from Ohio, Al Washington is from Ohio, Harry Heastand's from Pennsylvania. Thank God they're bringing in more guys, because if you can't you're never going to get enough guys from Texas and Florida and California and Georgia alone to have the kind of depth you need. You have to be able to get the guys from you're going to get your Jadarian Prices, right? From every now and then. You're going to get your Kyle Hamiltons every now and then, but you have to do better year after year after year in your backyard. And that's where I think Notre Dame, it would seem based on hires that they're doing that. Now, there's also some guy, Chancey Stuckey's from Georgia, right? Coached in Texas. There's some guys with some, some more national ties, but the majority of their staff now are Midwestern guys. Chris O'Leary, I think, he went to college in Indiana, didn't he?
Yeah.
Didn't he go to Indiana State?
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
where's
he
he
did.
originally
Yes,
from? Is he an Indiana guy,
or
where's he
from Indiana, I believe.
Isn't he from like Fort Wayne or something like that? Isn't he? Or
Fort Wayne,
So
I'm gonna look it up.
Yeah, big chunk of your coaching staff now is Midwestern guys with Midwestern ties. That's so important.
Yeah,
so important. Now, look, are you going to go into Ohio and beat Ohio State for 8 of their top 10 in-state players that they want? No, you just got to beat them for 1, right? 1 or 2.
Yeah.
In the public school or the non-traditional, let's say maybe some of the more well-to-do areas where Notre Dame can tend to go in and have some success. You just got to beat them for a kid here, a kid there, And the problem is that not only is Notre Dame not getting those kind of players out of Ohio, other than offensive linemen in recent years, they're getting their butt kicked by Ohio State in Chicago. They're getting their butt kicked by Ohio State in Pennsylvania.
Right.
And, that can't happen. That's the problem. And I don't think Brian Kelly paid enough attention and Brian Polian and those guys paid. I mean, if Brian Polian would have invested as much time in Pennsylvania as he invested in freaking Hawaii, Notre Dame might have some dudes, right? And so those are some errors. And then we stay in that region. So the Northeast is another area where Notre Dame has not paid enough attention in recent years. Ryan, we were kind of going over the numbers. New Jersey's 10th among all states in producing NFL players with 56. If you then add in New York, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, that's in Rhode Island, Vermont, that's another 46. So the Northeast, not known as a talent hotbed, has produced 102 players. That's 30 more than Ohio. That's 22 less than Georgia, right? There's some guys there. And that's where Penn State has been kicking Notre Dame's butt. Bama has been coming up to Jersey and kicking Notre Dame's butt. It's never Lou Holtz doesn't lose Minkah Fitzpatrick to Alabama, in my opinion. Joe Paterno doesn't lose Minkah Fitzpatrick. He would have gone to one of those 2 schools 30 years ago, right? And that's my point. Well, you can't get the elite athletes there. Well, why is Nick Saban spending so much time in Virginia, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania then? Right?
Good question.
So those are the things you look at and say Notre Dame, and this is where Marcus Freeman has to and get this operation going, is yes, we're going to go to those other regions, but we have to become a power, from New Jersey up north, even though it's not technically the Midwest, when you look at the map of the United States, what we consider the Midwest, which is like Western PA over to Illinois, right up to, to Michigan, Kentucky and all that, there's a lot of talent. I mean, like you said, Indiana, Illinois, and the Chicago Catholic League or the Ohio Catholic Leagues, 85 NFL players. Miami, Michigan, the rest of Ohio, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, 179 players. New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, 102 players, right? So those 3 regions alone right there, 366 players. Right, Kentucky and Texas produced Florida and Texas produced 381. Right, so those 2 big boys are still more, but like those are very pro Notre Dame areas where the numbers of total NFL players is very similar, and so Notre Dame has to have a bigger success rate. Now, on the field, success is going to help because you were talking about, it's good that Michigan's not as had going through their issues, and then Penn State's not been as good and all that. But at the end of the day, guys, it's still important that you get some of those players to come and be successful because beyond your on-field success, they want to see that guys that they recognize are having on-field success. Yeah, I know you guys are good, but you're not good with anybody from Detroit. You guys haven't got anybody from Detroit. You guys don't have anybody from Philly. You get what I'm saying? So like, there's still that notion of, but you're still not doing it with us. And it's kind of wild. And this is a small cultural point, but as the world has expanded, we're starting to see more people become more and more identify themselves in very small, sort of narrow views. My people, our people, my guys. We joke about all the time, like, Virginia, right? Like, I don't live in Virginia, haven't lived in Virginia for a long time, but when I hear Virginia, I still think that's my place. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so people still need to see that. Young people especially still need to see that, hey, what's my example? Who's the example for me? Like Ryan, when you talk to safeties, right? You say they have someone they can point to and say, yeah, okay, I can go to Notre Dame and be a top 10 NFL draft pick as a safety. Right? Now, Notre Dame's produced two first-round. We'll have produced two first-round draft picks as safety in the last, decade, right? When you look at Harrison Smith as well. Why is offensive line recruiting so easy for Notre Dame now compared to where it was when Harry Hiestand arrived? It's because of the guys he's put in the NFL.
Right.
Sure.
Right. And so you have to be able to get those guys. I think that's the wall you have to break down more than just whatever Michigan's record is and whatever Penn State's record is you have to finally start winning those battles, get those kids on campus and have success. Why are more Hawaii kids more willing to go to Notre Dame? It's not because of Notre Dame's record. It's because Manti went there and had success.
Yeah.
Sure.
Right. And that's the key, is they want to see, do people that are either look like me or come from my town or come from my high school or come from, you guys have done, just in your short time working for me, you guys have heard where kids will talk about like, hey, I played against that guy, or I know that guy. Like, yeah. Okay, he's doing this. And that's what matters to me. And so you can't get those kids if you don't make them, like, they have to feel like, hey man, we don't need to go down to Florida, Dante. We don't need to go out to California. We don't need to go out to California to get Nico. We don't need to go down to Alabama and get Chris Vizina. We don't need to go out to New Orleans and get Arch. We need to go out in Cali. We want you. You're right here. We need to have success with Detroit, which is why the next time Dante Moore is on campus, I'd better hear that Jerome Bettis never left his side. You know what I mean?
Right.
And that's why I think it's so smart for Marcus Freeman to start bringing more of the legends back. Absolutely. Because if you don't have it on your roster right now, you can show it from what you've done in the past.
Yeah.
And that's another reason why Marcus Freeman's embracing the tradition of Notre Dame is a masterful stroke. Yeah. Because what we don't have on our current roster, we darn sure have in our Rolodex of alums.
Yeah.
Right. And so
and if it doesn't resonate with Dante, it will resonate with his dad.
Oh yes.
It will definitely resonate
exactly
with his dad.
Right. Exactly right. And so you just look at those areas. We haven't even got into the Mid-Atlantic, some other areas, guys, but like Notre Dame, they have to up their hit rate, their success rate in those areas. If they do that, then it allows them to be more selective. And this is how Lou Holtz was. It allows you to be more select. You're going down to Miami to get Derek Brown. Mm-hmm. You're going down to Miami to get Pat Terrell. You're going down to Texas to get Tim Brown. I think didn't Tim Brown actually signed with Jerry Faust, but you get the point that I'm making, right? Like I'm going down there to get that guy, not that, well, okay, let's go try to find some athletes down in Florida. No, we're going down there to get Keon Keeley. Yeah. You're the dude, right? You're going down to Texas to get Peyton Bowen. You're the guy. You know what I mean? Braylon James, you're the guy. But you're still building, your foundation still has to be on kids from your region. And I think that's something that Ohio State, especially, this is where I think Ryan Day, even more than Urban Meyer, gets this. You can go recruit nationally, but you better make sure you're cleaning up in your backyard.
Yeah.
And they've done a good job of that. And Notre Dame has not. And that to me is an important thing for me. So, but we're not done yet, guys. There's still some more regions that we're talking about before we even get to the big boys that I think are important. Yeah. Let's talk about some of in those regions that we kind of like. You had your regional strengths, then this kind of the home away from home, New Jersey, Northeast, Mid-Atlantic. Another state that I would throw into that category, and I want to get your guys' opinion on that I think has been very underutilized by Notre Dame in recent years, is Tennessee. I want to throw Tennessee into that area because it is a state that borders Notre Dame, right? Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee. It's an area where Notre Dame has had a lot of success from, and not numbers wise, but you go back to Golden Tate, Harrison Smith, Alex Bars. Alex Bullard loved Notre Dame, but he had the family. He only transferred to back Tennessee because there was I think his dad got sick or something like that. I can't remember. There was something like that. It wasn't like a bad situation. And then recently, Prince Colley. That is an area to me that has been Notre Dame has not been taking advantage of that nearly enough in recent seasons. What do you guys think about needing to maybe add Tennessee to that list of priority states like a New Jersey, like a Pennsylvania, where again, you're not going to get numbers from it. You may get just one guy a year, but that one guy is going to be Golden Tate or Harrison Smith or Alex Bars or Prince Colley, that kind of guy. Yeah. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
I think it's a great point because, I mean, like you said, that there's the names to back it up that should be a state that you take a look at. And I also think the points of like University of Tennessee has been down in recent years, right? Mm-hmm. Vanderbilt, I mean, it's obviously a high academic institution, but I mean, you should be able to go into Tennessee and beat Vanderbilt for football players. It just comes straight up to it. I mean, I know obviously Coach Lee and all that type of stuff is going down there. So there's, whatever. But I think that if you wanted a player from Tennessee, I think that Notre Dame should be able to go into there. I mean, to be very point-blank period about it. And yes, there's the names that have obviously backed up the conversation that you're talking about. There's names that back up that there is evidence that you have to get back into there. And I mean, right now, you should be able to compete with Tennessee for those types of players. Like the conversation should always be that Notre Dame should be able to go into Tennessee and compete at worst. But definitely, I think that there's competition to be had with some of the names that have come out in recent years.
Heck yeah. If you're going to get a Walter Nolan, I'm all for it.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Go get that
I mean,
guy.
a guy like him, they're not going to get, let's be honest. Because Walter Nolan, Notre Dame,
yeah.
Let's just say this. Notre Dame was not, I get your point, Sean. Yeah. With Walter Nolan specifically, Notre Dame was not going to be able to meet his demands. Right?
That's a nice way of putting it.
I try my best. But the interesting thing about Tennessee is there's a lot of good private and private schools and Catholic schools. I mean, Golden Tate and Harrison Smith both went to Catholic schools. Alex Bars went to a private school. Notre Dame played against a kid this year at North Carolina that was from a private school, Ty Chandler. He was actually he wasn't a high school teammate of Alex Bars, I don't think. I think but from the same high school as Alex Bars. Dallin Hayden is another guy that went to a private school in that state that I think they could have had a shot at if they would have played that recruitment better. They were in position to, I think they had kind of overtaken Ohio State. And then the position coach bad-mouthed Tony Alford. Big mistake because Dallin Hayden loved Tony Alford. Dallin Hayden loved everything about Notre Dame except for the fact he just had better relationships with Tony Alford and Ryan Day. He loved them. He loved Notre Dame as an institution more. That's what was working. But then they went out and badmouthed Tony Alford, and it was like, okay, you're done. Because now it's like, well, I don't respect you. At the end of the day, it's still about the people. That, again, unforced error, right? It's an unforced – there's been so many of those that we've seen over the years where those have been the problems. There's not players from here. There's not players from there. So I think Tennessee, to me, could – again, it's not going to be a volume place.
Yeah,
right. But go find the Harrison Smiths. Go find the Golden Tates. Go find the Alex Barses. Go find the Dallin Hayes, and then don't screw up their recruitments, right? Go get the Alex Barses. There's enough Prince Collies, right? I'm trying to remember where why am I
Brian,
go ahead.
At what point Golden Tate they got in late on Golden Tate, didn't they?
No.
I know they got in late on Will.
On who?
On Will Fuller.
Yes, they did. They had to flip him from Penn State. Yeah,
because Malik hosted him along with CJ.
Yeah,
and they
flipped him from Penn State.
Yeah, they talked about how they made it a priority. Like, you guys have to help us,
right? Get
him. So
that was Denbrock. Denbrock loved Will Fuller because Malik and Fuller were in the same class,
right?
And so they got Corey Robinson, I think, kind of early. And then they got on Will. He had committed to Penn State, and then they eventually got on him. But that's another thing, though, guys, is is, in my opinion, they've been late to the game too much with some of these guys. And I think that's something that has started to change even before Marcus Freeman took over. Let's be honest. I think they did a really good job last couple years of getting on guys earlier. It really ramped up, I think, when Marcus Freeman got here as the defensive coordinator, right? Which is why they have 7 committed kids in the 2023 class. But you have to get on those kids early, Sean. You can occasionally flip a Will Fuller, but more often than not, you're going to lose that battle if you get on these kids late. And that's where I think like the addition of a guy like Chad Bowden, who can get on those 2024 kids early. Yeah. And Dre Brown is another one. They can get on those kids early, and then eventually the assistant coaches will get involved when, they're kind of done on the 2023 class. But it's good to have that. And that's why Marcus Freeman has fought for an expanded recruiting operation at Notre Dame. You need to have more voices that can legally get in touch with these kids and talk to these kids. And so I think that's an important thing. So the last 2 region guys are sort of the interesting ones, and it's the impact areas. And we kind of have broken it down into a couple areas, and they kind of bleed together, right? So we're going to kind of I think actually there is an area that we didn't just I'm going to kind of call a little bit of an audible here, because I had the Mid-Atlantic as part of that northeastern area. And I think the Mid-Atlantic needs to move into more of an impact area. The Mid-Atlantic, in our view, is the DMV, right? Maryland, DC, Virginia, and North Carolina, right? And then you throw in Georgia as part of this conversation. And what these are not areas where you're going to recruit 11, 12 kids a year. Mm-hmm. And you're not going to get your numbers from those areas. But these are the areas where you can get more impact players without having going all the way down to Texas and Florida and California, right? And you look at the Notre Dame roster now and in recent years, who have these areas produced? We're talking DMV down to Georgia, Chris Tyree, Kyle Hamilton, CJ Prosise, the Okwara brothers, they've Stephon Tuitt. These have been very good areas for Notre Dame, and they've started to up their success in Georgia, but sometimes I think they've kind of forced their hand in Georgia on kids where maybe that kid probably wasn't a take. Tommy Tremble is one who's had success, right? They went and found him from a private school. And the reason I think you're going to have successes is some of the geographic changes, right? When it comes with like migration. Is what tends to follow those jumps is a jump in the impact of the private schools, right? You start to see more and more kids go. So like as people left Chicago, the private schools also took a hit, right? And you start to see Atlanta. Now there's more of these really good private schools that used to just be academic institutions that now are academic institutions that also happen to have some really good football players starting to go there. Kyle Hamilton was obviously an example of that. We see the Pace Academy where Jamari Sawyer went, where Andrew Thomas went. Both of those kids were Jamari Sawyer's probably going to be what, Ryan? Day 2, day 3 pick this year. So did he come out this year?
Yep,
he go back to Georgia. Okay.
No, he was at the Senior Bowl and he had a nice week. I would say probably. I wouldn't be shocked if someone took him in the second round, but definitely third round. If not in my
day
opinion.
2 pick. Andrew Thomas was a top 5 pick. Did he go? What did he go? 4th? Right,
something like that. First offensive tackle in that class.
Right. Yeah. Notre Dame recruited both of those guys. Ended up not getting them, but there's Jaden Thomas is from that same high school. There's kids from those areas. You're starting to see more of these kids coming in North Carolina. Right. They're starting to see more of that in North Carolina, and so. I think that those are areas where you can get a Chris Tyree easier from Virginia than you're going to get that kid from Miami. Just as far as ease of not as far as like there's more of them in Miami. My point, guys, is it's going to be easier to convince a kid from Richmond, Virginia to make that trip to Notre Dame than it is going to be for Miami, right? Yep. Because in Miami, it's like you've got to bypass Miami, Florida State, Georgia, Alabama. I mean, think of all the schools you got to pass on your flight to Notre Dame. Who's Chris Tyree bypassing on his drive to Notre Dame? Virginia Tech, Virginia, Maryland, West Virginia, Ohio State. That's it, right? That's the only big-time program we'd have to pass. And so it just logically, it makes sense that if you've got a dynamic athlete like a Chris Tyree, like a CJ Procise, you're going to have Will Fuller. You're going to have a greater success getting those kids to come to Notre Dame than you will the kids from Jaylen Brown, right? I mean, and so are there more Jaylen Browns in Miami than there are Jaylen Browns in the North? Yes, but that's why the hit rate has to be successful. Having said that, it doesn't mean you don't recruit those areas. But to me, the Mid-Atlantic area is got to be where Notre Dame looks to really get the dudes, right? Like that's where you got to get your guys, right? And we look at this year's class, right? Monroe Freeling is an example of that. That's a top 100 guy, right?
Yep.
There's some kids from, as you look at kind of Notre Dame's offer list, there's some kids from those states that you say, boy, if they could get some of these kids, they're going to have a chance to put some pretty good players on the field moving forward.
No, I mean, and we talked obviously about Maryland. We've talked a lot about Maryland this year, right? Obviously with Jason Moore, the great defensive lineman out of DeMatha, and we talk about Devin Houston that's out there at St. James School, and you just mentioned Monroe Freeling, obviously out of South Carolina. Sullivan Absher is another offensive lineman out of North Carolina, top 250 type of kid out of South Plant. So there are players all over the place. I know you just mentioned Virginia, Brian, and someone made a great point in the chat. They said, for the longest time, Penn State kind of really did really well in Virginia. Their coach is now at Virginia Tech. He is no longer that's kind of been the
but real quick
archetype.
though, let me just interrupt you real quick, because Penn State's done well in Virginia going way back before Brent Pry showed up. I mean, I'm going back to like when I played, I played against James Boyd, right? He went to Penn State. Chris Bell, the receiver from Granby, he went to Penn State. Kevin Jones was a Virginia kid, if you remember. He went to Penn State. So Penn State's had success in Pennsylvania for a long time. And Notre Dame just flat out barely recruited the state for a long time. And occasionally they'd get a Julius Jones. But they just didn't pay enough attention to the state. Once they started paying attention to it, that's one of the good things Notre Dame did early in Kelly's tenure is they started to pay more attention to the state of Virginia. You got a CJ Procise. You got a Greer Martini. Even a guy like Darnell Ewell, it didn't work out, but they went and they battled for him, right? And so Virginia, to me, to your point though, but Penn State, it's the same thing as we talked about with earlier when Pennsylvania. Penn State's not the program they were under Joe Paterno when they were having all that success. When I was coming up, right, in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, Penn State was just over a decade removed from a national championship. Like they had years where they were a powerhouse program. I mean, when I was coming up, I remember the team, the defensive team that they had when they had Courtney Brown and LeVar Arrington on the same defensive staff, when they were producing big time running backs every single year. I mean, they were putting dudes out, right? And they're not that program anymore, in my opinion, And so, and I think that's what we have to think about is if you're a junior in college right now, and you look at the last 5 years, Notre Dame's been a significantly better program than Penn State. That's what these kids are going to be impacted by. Sean, you made the point about Detroit. Detroit kids are going to know what Notre Dame's been the last 5 years, and it's impressive. Dad's going to be the one that remembers the bus, right? Dad's going to be the member Rodney Gallagher's dad is going to have a better chance at remembering Rocket than Rodney Gallagher does.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I think it was Jaylen Brown's dad, for example, is a big Rocket Ismail fan. I doubt Jaylen Brown really knows who Rocket Ismail is.
Yeah.
But his dad sure does. But that's the thing is like Penn State's not that team anymore. Right. And that's why another reason why I think Notre Dame needs to have more success. And it's why, having a CJ Procise go in the third round, it's why getting the most out of Chris Tyree is going to be so important for them this year. Because they got to say, look, we've had some great athletes come to Notre Dame out of Virginia, going back to Julius Jones, right? And now moving forward, and it's CJ Procise and then now Chris Tyree, and it's going to open up that thing. But look, there's going to be years where there's just not a kid from Virginia that makes sense for you. It's just there's going to be years like that. And that's why it can't just be Virginia. It's got to be DC. It's got to be Virginia. It's got to be North Carolina. It's got to be that whole group. And DC especially is an area, Ryan, where Notre Dame has not put nearly enough attention in the DC area. And you're seeing Ohio State clean up in DC. You're seeing Bama come up and clean up in DC. Penn State's had some success in DC. Michigan's had success in DC. Notre Dame has barely touched it. And when they have tried to go there to get a kid, They've had great success. Cam Hart on the current team, Sam Mustipher, right?
Yeah.
I still wish they would have recruited PJ Mustipher. I still think that was a mistake that they didn't push for PJ, on the defensive line. They kept telling him that he was an offensive lineman. You know what I mean? Like, to me, that was a mistake, right?
Yeah.
And those are the mistakes. You can't have the miss of George Karlaftis. You can't, right? You've got to evaluate that one properly. You can't have the misses of a PJ Mustipher, right? Like, what would we be thinking about the nose tackle position right now if Notre Dame was returning PJ Mustipher, right? And so those are the things. You can't have those unforced errors in those regions. But DMV, North Carolina, and Atlanta are areas where you may not get 10, 12 kids a year. You may only get 3 or 4 a year from the entire region. Maybe, I think a more reasonable number is at least 5 or 6, right? When you consider DC, Virginia, North Carolina, and Atlanta, you should get 5 or 6 kids from that region a year. But what they're going to end up being, if you're doing it right, is they're going to be the top of the board guys for you. And I think the mistake that Notre Dame has made is they've gone down into Georgia in those areas at times and gotten depth players. And I think your depth players need to come from your backyard. Your depth players need to come from Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Jersey. Because number one, those players are more likely to stay.
I was going to say that. They're more likely to stay. Yeah.
Right. And number two, there's going to be a little bit more to me, it's going to continue to build on the bond that you have with those regions. Right. And then, because the thing is, if you miss on those kids, it can be just as damaging as, hey, man, I was buddies with KJ Wallace and he went to Notre Dame and the guy never saw a field. Right. And then he transfers to Georgia Tech and he becomes a starter. Those things can hurt you too. I liked KJ coming out of high school. It's just use him as an example. But I think that's the thing too, is when you go to those regions, you got to understand you're not going to get volume from that region. But when you go down there, you're going to go down there and get a dude. And I'm not talking about a dude that just is highly ranked like a Caleb Downs, but I view Tommy Tremble that way. I know for a fact Chip Long viewed Tommy Tremble as a dude. He did not view him as a 3-star recruit. I don't care what the rankings say. I'm talking about what Notre Dame thinks. They thought he was a dude. And I think that's the kind of guy you need to get. It's the Caleb Downses. It's the Stephon Tuitt's. It's the Tommy Trembles. It's the Chris Tyrees. It's the Romeo and Julian Akwaras. You got to go down there to get your dudes. And that's, to me, that's going to be the key. That's going to be the key, in my opinion, in those regions. Sean. I'm a bad influence.
He took your role today.
I'm a bad influence.
In those regions that are your foundation, how do you balance kids that are really eager to be a part, like Illinois kids, Indiana kids? Let's take Indiana kids that grow up in Indiana, grow up Notre Dame fans. They might be the backup kid on your board, but they really love Notre Dame. Like, how do you balance that from a recruiting standpoint? Because I find that very interesting. You talk about having that foundation with the bordering states, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio. How do you balance kids that have grown up, let's say they've watched Notre Dame go to 2 college football playoffs in the last 5 years. They love Notre Dame. How long do you make those kids wait?
I think it just depends on who you're looking at on that board, Sean. I think I've always had this feeling: if it's close, you take the local kid. If it's close,
okay, that's interesting.
But you have to be careful, because you don't want to fill up on those kids too early. Because here's the thing: if those kids really love you, they'll come when you open it up. Nick Martin was committed to Kentucky, where I believe their dad went. Right? Didn't the Martin's dad play at Kentucky?
Yes,
I believe
so.
And he was committed to his dad's alma mater, but when Notre Dame came calling,
it's a wrap.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Drew Tranquill was committed to Purdue for the longest time. And it was very hard for Drew to say no to Purdue, because that's the kind of kid you're like, that kid doesn't flip, because he's just that type of high character kid. I gave my word. But even then, even for a kid like that, I can't pass up Notre Dame.
Yeah.
Right. So you've got to, that's the thing, is you've got to be honest with them. Because here's the thing is, if you start lying to these kids and you burn those bridges, you can't do that. Because then here's the thing: if you screw over a kid at one high school, you don't just burn that bridge, because that coach is going to know this guy, he's going to know that guy, he's going to know this guy, he's going to know that guy. And all of a sudden you become that program. I think honesty is always the key. Hey, listen, we love you, but right now we've only got room for one kid in the class, and right now we got a couple kids ranked ahead of you. But look, stay with us, right? Because look, and this is the whole thing is you can't be afraid to lose a kid that you know you can get later. And this was kind of the issue that I had at times in some previous classes where it's like, why do you take that kid now? You can get that kid in 3 months if you miss out, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is a thing where you have to, it's a hard thing to juggle, Sean, but I've always felt like when it's close, give me the local kid. Now, there's always caveats because the local kid may come from a kind of family background where you don't feel he's got the support system at home that's going to encourage him in a way that is going to lead to him having success at Notre Dame. We've seen some local Indiana kids that have come to Notre Dame and gotten in trouble or not handled it or whatever, where the kid from Georgia may come from a better background. He may have a coach that's more supportive, parents are more supportive. So you always have to take those factors into consideration. But what I'm referring to is if all things are sort of equal in those areas and the skill level is similar, you take the local kid more often than not. That's what I think. And when I mean local, I mean the base. It's the base region, your home area, Chicago, Notre Dame, Indiana, and the Ohio Catholic. It's the Michigan, it's the Ohio, it's the Pennsylvania, it's the Jersey. It's you know what I mean? Like if you come down to it and it's, do you take the Jersey kid that do you take a Don Schuler who's maybe the 140th best player in the country from Jersey? Or do you take so-and-so from Georgia who's the 80th best player in the country? And you had to convince him to come where Don Schuler's like, man, I'll crawl on glass to get to South Bend, Indiana. Give me that kid.
Give me that kid.
Now, if a Don's a genuine 3-star player, right, and not by what we view, let's say we all sat and say, Don's love the kid, but he's probably a 4.7, right? Like he's probably going to be a career backup. I'm not passing on the number 80 player in the country for that version of a Don Schuler.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
He's got to be a player. A Don's a dude, because what you're going to get from a Don is some of the intangibles, some of the commitment to Notre Dame. And again, a Don's a public school kid.
Yeah.
He's not a private school kid, but he's a fit at Notre Dame. And he's a kid, as you guys know, like if that's the kind of kid that, yes, I want to go to Notre Dame, because him, his dad, the family, they understand that this is saying about football.
Yeah.
And I feel like kids from Jersey, Ryan, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like kids from Jersey get that more just inherently than some kids from other areas, because I don't know why. Part of me thinks it's because they are surrounded by so many of the good private schools, and because there are, some these kids from these schools are going to, these big time programs, and they're coming back and they're making a lot of money and they're successful business people, and they see what going to these big time maybe it's that, maybe it's the business. I don't know what it is, but I've always felt like the Jersey kids that got Notre Dame, it was a higher rate, like just right off the jump. It was a higher rate than maybe where you've got to convince a kid from Florida what Notre Dame can do for him. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to find it. Keon Keeley got that. His family got that right away. It's just we're talking generalities, like more often than not, this is going to be the case. Yeah. That's kind of how I feel. Like, maybe I'm wrong, Ryan, but that's you're from there.
Yeah.
I think especially when you're talking about the North Jersey section, right? Because like you guys kind of said this before.
Well, that's where the talent is.
No, it is. And there's no doubt about that. I'm a South Jersey guy.
I've recruited Jersey. Yeah. It's like I'd have to drive 2 hours in between schools to find a kid that can play at Muhlenberg, much less Notre Dame in South Jersey. Now, I'd say, hey, look, you know what? I didn't find the kids. I'm going to head on to Atlantic City for a couple of days because there's no kids right here. But that's kind of what I would do on my recruiting trips. But I'm kidding. But no, but to be honest, like Central and then up to Northern Jersey is honestly where the majority of the New Jersey talent. It's
Central,
like other states.
Central Jersey doesn't exist, Brian. Well, that's first and foremost. That does not exist.
Yes,
but
it
does. Every once in a while, obviously, you're going to find a Kelvin Harmon or a Jonathan Taylor down in South Jersey. But for the most part, we're talking about St. Peter's Prep, Don Bosco, Bergen Catholic. Like those are the schools that you're talking about. And I think that it is, like you said, I think it's just they've had so much success putting out those players to Michigan and Notre Dame, and because again, Rutgers is not a power in New Jersey. Right. It's not like
Syracuse
Graciano
is too far away and not a power also.
Exactly.
Right.
And Greg Schiano obviously did a good job his first stint keeping some of those talented players in New Jersey. But even then, it wasn't – you still weren't keeping the best players in New Jersey in the state of New Jersey.
Right.
Like that just wasn't going to happen. So they're getting recruited nationally. And I mean, and again, if you're from New Jersey or if you've just been to New Jersey, like you just kind of stated, North Jersey and South Jersey are just completely different worlds. It's North Jersey is very much more industrial. It's many more private schools. You're right. Obviously, you're closer to New York than a South Jersey is comparative to like a Philadelphia. So I think it makes sense that they're very prepared because I just think that it's just something that they're used to. Like it's just something. It's an everyday type of situation for them. Just how they're raised and just kind of I don't know. It's just kind of the atmosphere around there.
Honestly. I mean,
honestly.
like I coached at Muhlenberg College, which is a very high academic institution. I mean, we were in the same conference as Franklin and Marshall and Johns Hopkins and Gettysburg. I mean, it was a big time academic school. We would recruit Northern Jersey as hard as anywhere we could recruit. I mean, and we could recruit Philly. That was my top two running backs. My All-American running back was a Northern Jersey kid, Matt Bernardo. I mean, if that's not a Northern Jersey name of a kid, I mean, I don't know what is, right? I feel like that's an area that Notre Dame, it's surprising. Like Notre Dame has got some kids from those areas, but they haven't they've missed on way too many kids from Jersey.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like if you look at like Don Bosco, they haven't got a kid from Bosco since what? Elijah Shoemate in 2012, right? Bergen Catholic this year. I can't remember the last time they got a kid from Bergen Catholic until this year when they got Angeli and Jaden Bellamy. I'm trying to think. Like you've got you got Bergen Catholic, you got Bosco, Paramus. I can't tell you the last time they got a kid from Paramus Catholic. St. Peter's Prep.
I was going to say they did well in St. Peter's Prep for a couple years, and they haven't really been back.
In two classes. I mean, you had Brandon Wimbush, and then you went back and had 3 in 1 year with the Adamiolas and Shane Simon. But again, it's been kind of strange. And you're seeing these kids going to Bama and going to Michigan and going to Ohio State. And you're like, you got to start getting some of these guys. And, if you're building your program around going down to the big schools, and let's just wrap up with this, there's the big boy states, right? Just by sheer numbers, it's like the star rankings. Like, you can find kids in Idaho. There's like 5 kids in the NFL from Idaho. But you're going to have a higher success rate recruiting the state of Florida, right? It's like, 5 stars versus 3 stars. Florida, Texas, and California, to me, have always got to be important parts of what you're doing. Here's my question for you guys. How would you prioritize those 3? Because I think you need to do that. I think you need to say which one is going to be more important for us than the others. And I know what I want, and I know how I would rank it. I'm curious what you guys think and why. Of those 3 big boys, would you rank them? And should California not even be counted in this? Should it be more of like the Mid-Atlantic where Notre Dame it's a different type of state, where you should maybe look at it differently, where it needs to be more of a base. What do you guys think? Ryan, I'll start with you. What do you think about the big 3? How would you rank them in an order of importance? And how important is it that Notre Dame recruit those areas? Meaning we all agree it's important to recruit those areas, right? Can we get that out of the way?
Yeah.
What I'm saying is how important. Like, do you getting a kid or 2? Do you need to get like 5? Do you need to get 6 or 7 from those areas? Those are the things that we talk about. So I want to get Ryan first, start with you, and then Sean will go to you as far as just how we view those regions.
So, I mean, first and foremost, I do group them all together in the big boys, right? So I'm not separating California from them. I think that you have to have presence and high presence potentially in in all 3 of them, to be honest. And I think that if I was prioritizing it, not based upon even the numbers that you put out there, I would say Florida most important for me. Obviously it's not close to South Bend, but it is closest of the 3. I think it just makes sense to a degree. Notre Dame has had some success in Florida, looking back at, some of the players that they've gotten in. I mean, in this cycle, obviously they have Keon Keeley, who, we obviously we're not big fans of On3's representation of the 2023 class, but they did have Keon Keeley as 3rd ranked player. So good on them. Cedric Urban Jr. obviously is out of Florida as well. I think that Notre Dame has made that obviously a priority. I love the fact that it seems that Notre Dame is going very, very heavy, and this will be my number 2, is Texas. They are making it an absolute priority, especially on the wide receiver recruiting, right? Because obviously, and it makes sense, Chancey Stuckey at Baylor, he's been recruiting these guys now for a year. It's I agree, Mike. Thank you very much, man. I need my wife to say that once in a while, but I appreciate that very much.
If she says that to you, she's setting you. Look, you're younger than Sean and I. I don't think you've been married as long as we have. We will both.
No.
If your wife says that to you, she's setting you up. She's setting you up for something else that's coming down the road that you're not going to like. So just get nervous. If your wife says that to you, it's going to be a problem. Now back to your Texas conversation.
Yes. I'm sorry. So Chancey Stuckey, of course, with the Baylor ties for a year. He has obviously great relationships with Braylon James out of Del Val, Jaden Greathouse out of Westlake, who are 2 of the top wide receiver targets on the board for Notre Dame. And they are making it an absolute priority. They have obviously Peyton Bowen, who's out of Denton Guyer, who is in my opinion a top 50 player in the class. I think he could border on 5-star status if he has a great season. I think he's that type of athlete. So Notre Dame has made it clearly a priority. They would be my number 2. California, I just think that the numbers that you spoke, right? I think it was like 168 was the number on California comparative to high ones in the other 2. The numbers are in that conversation.
It's 198, 189, and then 168.
Yep. So it's in the ballpark. And I mean, look at it. Florida's not very close to Notre Dame. Texas isn't very close to Notre Dame. California's not very close to Notre Dame. So it's not a proximity issue.
Right. All these kids got to hop on a plane to get to Notre Dame. I mean, that's the reality of it.
And if you need, and I just think if the base, like you mentioned the base, obviously to stay near the, Ohio Catholic and the Indianas. You mentioned Indiana though, obviously the states that you're in are not the greatest football bed for talent, right? Sure. So you need to go get elite talent to the 3 elite states in high school football. That's why I just think that they are in the same conversation for me.
Why Florida number 1? Besides, you mentioned just a little bit closer. I mean, it's a 20-minute difference in flight, 30-minute difference in flight. So why is Florida the number 1 for you?
I honestly don't know, Brian. To be honest with you, I don't have a great response to it. When I think of Florida, I associate Florida with speed, and I think that is a big point of emphasis that Notre Dame needs to improve on in multiple areas of their team. So. Yeah. If I want speed in my high school football, in my opinion, I'm going down to the state of Florida. It's just kind of what pops into my head when I think of Florida. I don't know if that's fair. I don't know if
it's good. I mean, it's not about being fair or unfair. I just think it's about you have to, when you do all these things, I think there's always merit to I mean, there's not a right or wrong answer in my view. I think it's just whatever you decide, you have to have a reason for it. And it could just be like the thing I would say about Florida is I'd be willing to bet, and again, this is just my gut, I'd be willing to bet that if you look at Florida's number, which is not that much more than Texas, 192 to 189, and then California 168, that you'd see more receivers, corners coming out of Florida than the others. That's just my gut feeling, right? And I could be wrong on that.
Sure.
But that would be my gut. That would lead me to say maybe that's where you've got to go down to Florida to get a couple of those guys that can just flat out run. That's my gut. Now I could be wrong, and if I was going to make a decision as a recruiting coordinator, I would actually look at the data to support that. But to support your case, I would go with that. Sean, how would you rank the big 3? Now, again, we all agree that they should recruit all 3 of these. We're not saying that they shouldn't. We're just trying to say what level of importance do you put on the big 3, and of the 3, how do you rank them?
If you'd asked me this 5 years ago, it wouldn't have been close, but I still have California number 1 historically because of what California means to Notre Dame and why they end the season in California specifically. So those coaches can hit those schools that they have great connections with, specifically the Catholic schools, the De La Salles, not so much Mater Dei, because Mater Dei pretty much has become a feeder right into USC, but the relationships that have been built up over the years in that region, because Notre Dame is always out there at the end of their season, and the talent, let's just be honest, just the talent and the quarterbacks that they continually produce in that state, I would put California number 1. And that's after we've seen a migration from California of talent go to states like Arizona and Nevada.
Right. We're going to talk about those two states at the end. We're going to talk about some sleeper areas that Notre Dame needs to look at.
And,
so,
even with that, I still would have California number one because of those multiple reasons. If you're combining Florida and you're combining it with Georgia, I would put it number two.
I would not do that because if you've been to Florida, it is a whole other than Jacksonville, the rest of Florida is not like Georgia.
This is what I would say. And we've had this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
I've talked to multiple coaches that love the talent in Florida, but when they get them on campus, they're not coached up as well as you might think. Super talented, super fast, but what you have to go through to develop and get them up to speed from a coaching standpoint can be kind of a deterrent. This is why I'm going to bump Texas moving forward up to 2 and put Florida at 3. And Cam McDaniel pointed this out to me. There's so much talent in Florida, and with the legacy program that Marcus Freeman has established, all of the guys that came up to Notre Dame from Texas are looking forward to putting on satellite camps to go and establish Notre Dame as a stronger imprint in the state of Texas. This is why I think Texas moving forward is going to be even more important. Even when you go back, Notre Dame believed Texas was important because they would take several of their games there to play. I was about to call it the legacy games, not the Shamrock Series games. And they would play the Shamrock Series games down in Texas. They understood how important Texas was from a recruiting standpoint. So I'm going to elevate Texas because of the way the staff has recruited Texas and the way they're trying to recruit Texas. I think they've elevated Texas to that standpoint. So I'm going to go California 1, Texas 2, and then I'll have Florida in 3rd. And that's not saying anything less of Florida from a recruiting standpoint. Because if you're going to get a Keon Keeley, you go get him.
Right.
Like if there's another kid at that same level in Florida, you go get him.
Mm-hmm.
But I just think the relationships are a little bit stronger in Texas and California. So I'll leave those 2 at the top.
I'm going to have a very interesting conversation with Rod Babers about this on Wednesday. Okay. And I am not saying this because of Rod Babers. I feel like Texas has to become number 1 now moving forward. Nice. Here's why. You have to look at a lot of different factors when you're recruiting Notre Dame. The key out of these 3 states, what I'm looking for when I'm going to Texas, California, and Florida, what I'm looking for is I'm looking for guys that are elite players or elite upside that are going to be difference makers early. That's where you find you're a player when you step foot on campus. And this is where you can throw Georgia into the conversation, Sean, in that's also a state where I'm looking for those dudes. Mm-hmm. Right. And Louisiana would be like that. If you're going to go down to Louisiana, you're going to get a kid that you think can play right away. Because if you don't, you're going to have what happened with Logan Diggs. If Chris Tyree doesn't get hurt, Logan Diggs, I think, is gone.
Yeah.
Right. Because you can't bring a kid up from Louisiana and not play him. Right.
Yeah.
So that's where you're getting you're going for the guys that have really high ceilings, whether they're highly ranked or not. They're the really high ceiling guys that can help you. Ideally help you early on. And that doesn't mean you don't find the occasional Durham Smythe, and that's fine. You can go get those kids from there. You don't turn those kids down, but it's like this is what you're really looking for. And you go, it's the Peyton Bowens, it's the Keon Keeleys, it's those kind of guys. The reason I think Texas needs to become a priority is because if you're going to do recruiting properly, you have to be willing to look at the things that impact why are there the best recruits, more recruits from there. And a lot of it has to do with population shifts. And to me, yes, you make California priority, but there's a lot of people leaving California for Texas, and it may not matter in 2023, but by 2029 it will.
Yeah.
Right. It's same thing with like Arizona. I think you also have to look at what are the school systems like that your kids are going from this state to that state. If you compare the 3 states, there's a lot more of the private schools in Texas and California that I think better prepare kids to handle the academic rigors of Notre Dame than you see in Florida. This is why Keon Keeley is such a unique player, because he actually goes to one of those schools in Florida that prepares you. But if you look at the school systems, and every study I've ever seen shows this is something I had to look into when I was recruiting the state of Florida, is it is not a great state when it comes to public education. It's just not. And a lot of kids from Florida aren't being given the tools they need to be successful in college. And it means there's going to be a lot of kids that maybe have the right GPA, but have they been given the resources in regards to how to maximize the intelligence they may have?
Yeah.
It's a more of a battle. It's more of a struggle for me. And that's been played out at Notre Dame. Think about all the kids from Florida. How many of those kids have gotten in a lot of trouble their first 2 years on campus? I mean, it's almost all of them.
Yeah.
I mean, Dex, Tavon, Stefferson, Lynch. I mean, even Justin Ferguson, who wasn't even a big-time recruit, got Kevin Austin. I mean, and the funny thing is, the kid that came from the roughest area, Joe Wilkins, has been exactly the kind of Notre Dame kid you look for, right? But for the most part, a lot of those kids that there's been Spencer Boyd came here, left after a year. Like it just has been a problem with Florida. It just is, because I think a lot of these kids it's a big shock, in my opinion, going from a public school in the state of Florida to Indiana or to Notre Dame. Whereas a kid from Denton Guyer is not going to have as much big of a problem. Now, Texas doesn't have the public schools at some other big time, but it's pretty good.
Yeah.
And I think and there's so many kids I mean, the other thing too is I feel like Florida actually has better athletes than Texas. But I feel like, to your guys' point, or to Sean's point, the coaching in Texas is dramatically better. The preparation in Texas is dramatic. I mean, these kids from Florida just kind of show up and they're just really athletic, and you got to teach them how to play, because unfortunately they don't pay coaches well. I mean, you're seeing coaches from Florida leaving constantly to get jobs in other states.
Yeah.
Coaches, the best coaches are getting poached out of Florida because you just can't pay them. They're just not paying them. In Texas, I mean, there's high school head coaches in Texas that wouldn't take a Division I job as a position coach because it'd be a pay cut. You know what I mean? And, you look at the facilities they go to. I mean, it's insane. I mean, there's kids in high schools at Texas that go to the D1 programs and are like, man, your facilities aren't as good as what we had in high school. So if the goal is to look for guys that are ready-made, guys are going to come and play in day one, there's a lot of things you got to overcome with some of these Florida kids that you don't in Texas. And the reason I would say Texas is I think Texas, of all the big states, has the most potential to give you more volume on a consistent basis. Where Florida, you're going to get a Keon Keeley, you're going to get a Cedric Urban. You may, in some years, get 3 or 4 kids occasionally. There's also going to be years where you get nothing from Florida. I think if you do Texas right, you can get minimum 2 to 3 kids every year and occasionally get 5 or 6 kids from Texas. I believe you can get to that if you make it a priority year after year after year. And Texas and Florida are states where there's more and more people moving to those states. So that's partly why they're my 1 and 2. California's bleeding population, right? It's just a fact, okay? This is not making a political statement. I'm making a statement of fact. And when you consider how difficult it's been to get those kids to leave the West Coast, and I'm going to say something else that some people may not like, but I think West Coast kids tend to be a little less passionate about things. Sean, what's the word I'm looking for here? I don't want to say it.
Laxed. We'll say laxed.
Soft.
Oh, right.
It just – I often wonder, like, does that kid really love the game, or is he just like, hey, bro, let's go surfing? And that's kind of always been my vibe, and some of it's unfair. And there's some kids from California that are absolute monsters. I just would be a little more careful about California being as important as Texas moving forward because of all those factors, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, I mean, the best state in the best school in the state, you have like no shot at getting a kid from. Modern day. I mean, just almost no shot.
No shot.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, you had a kid committed and he leaves you to go sign with a school and went 4-8 last year.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And complains about the pass game, even though you were like 30, 40 yards per game more passing this year than when he committed to you. Right? You have no chance. I mean, unless you're Bama. I mean, maybe down the road, if Notre Dame does what Bama does, they can get Bryce Young. But let's be honest, if USC was USC. Bryce Young doesn't decommit from USC to go to Alabama.
Right.
But can we be honest about that? Right.
Yep.
So I just feel like when I look out at California, yes, you recruit California, but to me, I treat California a lot like Florida, very targeted. I want that guy. I want Isaiah Foskey. I want Keon Keeley. Where Texas almost becomes sort of like we're going down there for those guys, and we're going down there to find some depth guys because there's so many kids. And the other thing too is you've got Texas and A&M and Oklahoma, right? But I feel like there's a lot of kids from Texas that aren't from Texas, right? They're not born and raised in Texas, or they're not maybe beholden to the in-state schools like they were 20 years ago when kids from Texas were born and bred from Texas. So I just feel like, and I'm going to ask Rod Babers about this, and I'm really curious what his thoughts is because he's from Texas. He went to the University of Texas. He lives in Texas now. And we've had some really interesting conversations about this, and I'm going to really push to kind of see what his belief is. But I feel like Texas is an area where you can actually get volume plus impact players if you do it right. You can get a Peyton. I mean, think about this year, guys. I mean, let's look at this. Let's look at Notre Dame's offer sheet and say who. So right now, Notre Dame has 2 kids from the state of Florida, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Who from the state of Florida right now do you think Notre Dame will get? I will say, I think if they wanted him, I think they'd have a shot to get King Mac. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Who else from the state of Florida do you think Notre Dame right now has a chance to go down and get right now?
Well,
to add to that list.
I don't know if he's originally a Florida kid or not, but he's at IMG. Samuel Mpemba seemed to be in a good
Let's
spot
go with
him.
that are from there. Like to me, like so
Okay.
Robert Haynes, he's not a Florida kid, he's a Pittsburgh kid. And Pemba's a St. Louis kid, right? Carnell's a Chicago kid. So let's try and kind of look at it like that way. But I agree with you about Mpemba, by the way.
Yes.
I mean, you're not going to get Tyler Williams,
No.
right?
Jalen Brown's unlikely. Yeah.
Right. You're not going to get, Richard Young or Tryon Webb or Brandon Ennis, right? I mean, you're not, like I think I said Tyler Williams.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see a lot of those guys looking at Notre Dame. You look at Texas, and right now, Texas, you've got one commit from the state, right?
Peyton Bowen, yep.
But I say, man, I see Notre Dame having a chance to get several kids from Texas in this cycle.
I agree.
I mean, I think they could have got Jackson Arnold if they wanted him, right?
Yeah.
They didn't. I mean, they did. You get what I'm saying, right? You've got Jaden Greathouse, which I don't think they're going to get, but I think they got a shot at. I would, if I was making a prediction for the Notre Dame class right now, absolutely have Braylon James in it.
Yeah.
Right? Ryan, if Notre Dame wanted Ryan Yates, I think he commits to Notre Dame. Would you agree with that?
I agree 100% of that, yes.
Okay.
Yep. And I think it's big. Obviously, I agree with the opinion on Jaden Greathouse, but I mean, getting him on campus a couple times over the next few months is going to be huge for them. So
I think Darian Gillette, they have a legitimate chance with. They can get him on campus.
Mm-hmm.
We've already talked about Peyton Bowen as a guy. Malik Muhammad seems to have interest. Braxton Myers has interest in Notre Dame. They're talking about maybe getting a visit from the Toviano kid, who, again, I'll believe that when I see it, right? But the point is, there's some legit dudes from the state of Texas that have legitimate interest in Notre Dame, where in Florida, it's like you almost got to bat 1,000 to get 4 guys, right?
Yeah.
And so, because there's just Notre Dame is viewed differently in Texas than it is in Florida. It just is. The other part of it is once you get outside of Texas, Oklahoma, and A&M, you got to go some distance. Unless you're from Houston, then LSU's not that far away. But if you're a Dallas, Fort Worth kid, or where a lot of the kids come from, there's some distance to go to some of those other schools. You got to hop on a plane to go to Bama. You got to hop on a plane to go to Florida. If you're from Florida, Alabama, I mean, think about all the schools that are right there. If you're in Florida, that Notre Dame's got to go beat, right? And so I feel like also the emphasis on academics, you're finding more kids in Texas that understand the value. And Sean, you may talk to Cam about this next time. I just feel like from recovering recruiting that you find more kids from Texas that view Notre Dame positive because of the academics, where some of these Florida kids were picking Notre Dame for football alone. Aaron Lynch picked Notre Dame for one reason and one reason only, football. Kevin Austin picked Notre Dame for football. His mom picked Notre Dame for the other stuff, but Kevin didn't necessarily value that, right? Spencer Boyd, a lot of these kids that came to Notre Dame, it was for football. Where I think Texas kids tend to look at it a little bit differently. That's another reason why I would put Texas number 1. I'd go Florida 2 because you've just got to be able to get some kids from Florida. You've got to be able to get Keon Keeley, right? I think you're going to have a better shot of finding a Keon Keeley than you are of going out and getting a Corey Foreman or a Kayvon Thibodeau or a guy like that, right? So California to me would be 3rd. And I would almost make California like the list we talked about with like Georgia, where it's targeted. You go find a kid you like. California to me is just, it's not what it was. Sean, your point about tradition made a ton of sense. But I just feel like because so many of those kids stay west, Oregon's an option. Arizona's, Washington's an option, USC, UCLA. And if those kids are leaving, they're going to football schools, right? Like football schools, you know what I mean? Like they're going to Bama. I just feel like Texas is an area where you could really steal some dudes, especially if you start winning, and you go out and go to the playoff again, or you win a championship. I mean, look what Ohio State's done down in Texas. Good Lord.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the receiving core they've been able to put together from the state of Texas. Yeah. And if you look at the recruitments, they sold the academic piece really well. Now, we could argue whether that's legit or not, but they went down there with guys like Garrett Wilson, and they preached about what we can do for you off the field as well. That worked for Garrett Wilson. Unfortunately, Notre Dame wasn't in a position to do that. But 3-4 years from now, if you can build the offense where it needs to be, maybe even 2-3 years from now, get a Dante Moore, now all of a sudden you can go be a player for Garrett Wilson. You can go down there and be a player for some of these kids from Texas that they're getting. And to me, that is something that I view as saying, hey, that's an area where Notre Dame could really have some big-time success from impact players plus volume. What do you guys think about that?
For volume, I think the only reason I would put Florida at the bottom, and you know what? I don't have a problem with Texas being number 1. Especially after talking to some of the former players and their interest in actually establishing Notre Dame as a prominent program in that area through the legacy program, I'm all for it. Totally agree with what you just said. California, for me, like I said, for multiple reasons. The connections, especially to the Catholic schools in that state, the reason why historically Notre Dame purposely schedules to be in California at the end of the year and purposely wants their coaches out there to recruit, and the fact that 3 early enrollees are from the state of California, like right now on campus. So I just think looking at possibly how the coaches have been looking at it, I think Florida will be the state that you go get the top guy. And if you get a second guy in that cycle, it's a great year in the state of Florida. Right. Notre Dame expects to get 3 to 4 kids out of California every year. I think that's the expectation. It might not be the modern day guys, but you have Servite, you have Centennial, you have, like I said, De La Salle. You have those 3 schools that have great athletes as well. And the programs, there's really not that much difference between modern day and those programs. Those programs compete with modern day pretty well.
Well, you look at Centennial, where they got Javon McKinley and Jaden Mickey, obviously Bishop Alameda Jr. to Alamaka. I think California has to, again, these are important states.
Yeah.
But to me, it's like 2-3 guys a year, 1 to 2 out of Florida, sometimes none. I think Texas can be a state where you get more than 2 or 3 guys a year. That's where I'm coming from. Yeah. Now, some of those guys are going to be depth players. Some of those guys are going to be a Durham Smythes, the Nano Southamensas, right? Like they're not all going to be dudes. So that's part of it. And occasionally you're going to have a big year out of California. I just don't think it's going to necessarily be a year where it's consistent. Now, here's a question for you guys. There's a couple sleeper areas that aren't known for producing a lot of football players. And if you look at the list that you got from the NFL, again, the NFL is talking about what's produced now, but there's a couple areas that I think are very underrated in starting to really produce a lot of NFL players. There were over 20 players in the start of the NFL season, over 20 from the state of Arizona. And that state is starting to see again, you have to study geography, you have to study population shifts when you look at this. Like every time a census comes out, you say, boy, that state just gained 2 or 3 electoral votes. Why does that matter? Do you know how many people have to move to your state since the last census for you to gain 2 or 3 electoral votes or to lose 2 or 3 electoral votes?
Yeah.
You know, like somebody asked me, is like, well, how do you, I said, go look at like the 1984 election, right? Or the 1980 election, which is, 30, 40 years ago, and see how many electoral votes Ohio had and Pennsylvania had and Illinois. I mean, they were high, right? Texas wasn't very high. Florida was down. Georgia was down. Those were mostly rural areas, but those states have all built up as Ohio's in the teens now. Pennsylvania, I think, has gotten down to that level too. I think where they're like high teens, early 20s, right? They're not the big population states that they used to be. And so you have to follow that. And Arizona is one of those areas that's benefiting. It's not just Texas benefiting from the people leaving California. Arizona's getting a ton of it. I mean, we were out in Arizona for the Fiesta Bowl, and the last time I was out there was when Notre Dame played Ohio State back in the 2015 season. And I got to tell you guys, like, there's so many new neighborhoods that are not there now than when I was out there just 5-6 years ago. You know what I mean? It's like, wow, this place is booming. And you look at the talent. I mean, there's some big time players. I mean, Benjamin Morrison, Tosh Baker. You've got the kid that they offered the other day, right? Elijah Page. There's some really good football players starting to come out of the state of Arizona. And I think that if you're going to recruit California, if you're like, to me, it wouldn't even be about California. I would just kind of throw the West Coast all into one category.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, Brian. Would you throw like the Vegas even out to California?
I would say you got to get 4 or 5 West Coast kids a year. So last year, you only got 2 kids from California, right? But I'm throwing Tobias Merriweather into that conversation. I'm throwing Benjamin Morrison into that conversation, right? So that right there, that's 4 kids that they got last year from the West Coast off just the top of my head, right? And I'm trying to look at so you got Merriweather, you got Benjamin Morrison, you got Junior Tuialamaka, you got Jaden Mickey. Mm-hmm. So that's the 4. That's the 4 you got there, right? There's years where you can get 5 or 6 West Coast guys if you guys throw into Nevada. So this year you got Justin Rhett, right? I count that as a West Coast pickup, right? And so to me, that's more of how I would view the West Coast as opposed to just California, because as California loses people, where are they going? They're not all leaving in the time zone, right? Or 2 time zones. They're not coming to Ohio and only Florida. They're going to Arizona. Yeah. They're going to Utah. They're going to Oregon. They're going to Washington. They're going to Nevada. They're going to some of these other states that are kind of Colorado, for example. Again, you want to look at, political shifts to point this out. Colorado used to be a very conservative, rural Republican state. Now it's a blue state, right? Why? Because we've seen a mass migration from California. So population has gone up, right? And politics change, which doesn't really matter to this conversation. But again, I'm pointing out that where are they coming from? They're not moving to Colorado from New York or Massachusetts, those blue states. They're moving there from California, right? And so again, it's about, you've got to be able to, if you're really going to have a long-term view of this, you have to be able to monitor those things. So that's why, to me, to your point, Ryan, Washington, Nevada, Arizona, Utah to a degree, all those states are going to become sort of one thing for me. And if I'm looking for the numbers that I used to think I could get out of California, like you used to be able to get like 5-6 dudes a year out of California. I don't see that happening, right? Especially now that Lincoln Riley's at USC. We got Notre Dame hasn't been getting 5 or 6 out of the year when they've had to go against Clay Helton, right? I mean, they couldn't beat USC CJ Williams was on the verge of flipping to USC when they didn't have a head coach.
Yeah.
Think about that. You know what I mean? So you go out and find the Tobias Merriweathers. I don't care if he's from LA or Washington or Arizona or Nevada. Go out and get Justin Rhett. I don't care whether he's from Mater Dei or he's from Bishop Gorman, which has been a good school to Notre Dame, right? And so that to me is kind of how I would view it as we kind of wrap this up. And I think one other state that I think we need, one other areas, I like that Notre Dame is starting to get more and more into St. Louis. You're starting to see more and more kids from the St. Louis area that are like, it used to be, Sean, where there was talent there, but you couldn't get any of those kids into school.
No.
That's changing.
It's changing.
That's changing in a big way. And it's good for Notre Dame, in my opinion.
It used to be all Big 12. Big 12 had
Yep.
St. Louis on lock with some, some SEC teams mixed in. But what you're trying to see is Notre Dame really, really putting their foot down in that region, getting in good with the coaches and the particular programs.
Right.
I think in the next 2 cycles, the introduction or to get into the club, Notre Dame paid the door charge. 24 cycle, they're going to be VIP.
Yeah.
Because they've gone through the process now. Right. They're going to walk in, they're going to be VIP, have better access, and a much better shot.
And it's partly because you've got the kid, you've got Kyron, you've got Gabriel Rubio, you've got Tyson Ford. Now you've opened it, like you said, that's what gets you in the door. And then you've built those relationships. Now you can really start to have an impact with some of those guys. So, Sean, I know you got to run.
I do.
But guys, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think this is a lot of fun. I think the point being that we can all agree on is that there needs to be a very clear plan. And one thing that has to absolutely change is the Midwest and Northeast has to become a bigger priority for Notre Dame. I think the hires that Marcus Freeman made leads me to believe that they plan that's going to be part of the plan. You also can't abandon the Southeast and Texas and the West Coast at the expense of it. It has to be a holistic plan. Your volume is going to come from the Midwest and the Northeast. Your impact a lot of times is going to come from the Southwest and the Southeast and the Mid-Atlantic. I think, but it's got to be very strategic when they go about it. And so I think, I hope that they are going to become more organized in that regard. I think that's been an issue in the past. They just kind of going to get guys. There wasn't like a clear strategy. Hey, they'll go to New Jersey if it's the right kind of kid, but not, whereas I think when you look at like Harry Hiestand recruiting the offensive line, he's tended to stay in certain regions. And then occasionally he'd go get a guy that he might want from outside that region. Occasionally he would go down to Florida and get a kid. Occasionally he's going to go down to the Carolinas and get a Monroe Freeling, right? Occasionally he's going to go out to the West Coast and get an Aaron Banks. But his bread and butter is going to be the regions we talked about. Very purposeful in that regards, right? And so I think as a whole team, a whole staff, that needs to be a part of it. So we're going to see if they're going to carry that out that way. And I'm really looking forward to what Rod Babers is going to say about Texas, because I have some very strong, as you guys saw, I have some very strong opinions on the importance of Texas to Notre Dame's future in that regard. And so anything to add, guys, before we get out of here?
No, the buzz is crazy about Notre Dame. Ryan, I know you talk to a lot more kids, but I know locally in these states, in Indiana, Illinois, even going over to Ohio and Michigan, the buzz right now for Notre Dame over the next 2-3 recruiting cycles is at an all-time high. It's at an all-time high. There's a lot to be excited about as a fan base.
Yeah. No, and I'm just excited about, again, I feel like we keep talking about it a little bit, but there's been a change in ideology when it comes to recruiting and how Notre Dame is tackling some of those things. And it's exciting, honestly, that because I feel like Texas was not a player for Notre Dame much, over recent years. And then all of a sudden you have the Braylon James, the Jalen Greathouse,
because they didn't try.
Exactly.
That's the thing. They didn't try.
That's the ideology shift, though. That's what I'm talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow, kids from Texas really like Notre Dame. Wow. They've always would have liked Notre Dame. It's just you didn't try to go down there. There was no, well, we don't have anyone from Texas. I don't care. Then have someone from Indiana that's from there. Go establish those relationships in Texas. I mean, it has to be intentional, right? It takes work. And Sean, I think the thing you mentioned about there's a lot of buzz about Notre Dame is Marcus Freeman. I believe timing is important, guys. I believe that Nick Saban came to Alabama at just the right time, where him being a great coach with some of the things going on in the SEC just really set up nicely for him to do what he's done. I think, I think there's a lot of different things that kind of go into this. And timing is important. And I think Marcus Freeman stepping into Notre Dame at the right time, where his charisma and his talent, his ability is going to make a lot of buzz, Sean. But you know what else also has created a lot of buzz? Notre Dame's been really good for 5 years, which means the formative years of these kids' lives they've only known Notre Dame of being at least really good, not on Alabama's level, not on that, but they're really good, right? These kids have grown up. These kids didn't grow up with 2011, 2010. These kids don't know who the heck Charlie Weiss was, right? They don't know who Ty Willingham was. They don't know who Bob Davie was. They don't know that era. They know the era of Notre Dame football, which in 5 of the last 6 years has been a 10-plus win football team. Oh, I'm sorry. 6 of the 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 20. 6 of the last 7 years has been a 10-plus win football team, and 5 straight years has won at least 10 games.
Yeah.
Right? That's what they know. You combine that with the jump in NFL production, and then you add this recruiting staff that I think Marcus Freeman's put together. I think that's where you start to say this thing could be special. But they're never going to maximize their potential as a program or recruiting if there's not a strategy in place. And that's what we're going to find out. And that's what this discussion was about. So great stuff, guys. Love it. Love it. Love it. Love it. Appreciate y'all. Just a heads up for everybody. I just got a text from my dad. The doctors came out, talked to him. My mom's surgery took a lot longer than they thought, but she got out of it. She's good. They had to do some more repairing of her insides than they thought, but she's out and she's in recovery. She's going to be in the hospital for about 4 days. Really, really appreciate all the prayers. And obviously she can continue to needs them. I'll be flying home Thursday. She's going to get out of the hospital on Friday. So I'll be there to kind of help take care of her for about a week. And really appreciate all the prayers, but a lot of people have asked and texted about, what's the latest with her. So she is finally out of surgery, went almost 5 hours. So about an hour longer than expected. But she's out. So thanks everybody and Ryan and Sean had both been prepped. Like if I bail, you guys got to just take over, if I got some bad news, but thank God I did not. Genuinely, thank God that I did not. So anyway, so for Sean, for Ryan, I'm Brian. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell, share our podcast, sign up for the message boards, and of course, come back and join us tomorrow. We appreciate y'all very, very much. Thank you for being a part of the Irish Breakdown podcast.